There are Easter eggs buried in Ark Raiders that the developers never officially acknowledged, hidden so deep in the game world that dedicated players spent months piecing them together, and tonight we are going through every single one of them. I put this video together because I kept watching people share fragments of these discoveries across Discord servers, Reddit threads, and community forums, and nobody had ever pulled them into one cohesive place. The deeper I went into the research, the more I realized these weren't isolated secrets. They formed something bigger. The specific choice I made when assembling this video was to organize everything by theme rather than by the order people discovered things. Because when you lay certain Easter eggs side by side, patterns start emerging that you simply do not see any other way. Some of the connections I'll walk you through tonight only became visible to me after weeks of cross-referencing, and I wanted to honor that process by presenting it in a way that actually builds towards something. This is not a definitive guide to what Ark Raiders is secretly about. This is one interpretation built from hundreds of hours of community work and my own time in the game, offered to you as an invitation to look at a world you thought you knew from a completely different angle. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. Signals from the Surface. Easter egg number 1 is one that took the community an embarrassingly long time to find, mostly because it requires you to do something that no sane person does while playing a survival game, which is stand completely still and do absolutely nothing for several minutes. If you enter the communications relay station on the eastern edge of the map and let the ambient audio play without moving, without opening any menus, without interacting with anything, you will eventually hear what sounds like white noise shift. It is subtle enough that most people assume it is a compression artifact from the audio engine, or just the normal ambience of a broken facility, but community member Raelthas on the Ark Raiders subreddit clipped the audio, ran it through a spectral analyzer, and discovered something buried inside that white noise at a frequency most speakers cannot fully reproduce. There is a structured signal in there. It is not random. It cycles on a loop that lasts exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and it does not repeat until that timer completes. The signal itself, once isolated from the surrounding noise, resolves into something that sounds remarkably like a shortwave radio transmission from the early era of radio broadcasting. Researchers in the community pointed out that the tonal pattern shares characteristics with what is called a numbers station, specifically the kind of numbers station that operated during the Cold War period, where a voice would read sequences of digits over an open frequency with no explanation and no acknowledgement. The connection to Ark Raiders is interesting because the game takes place in a world where surface communication has largely collapsed, and the presence of what appears to be a legacy shortwave transmission embedded in ambient sound raises the question of whether someone, somewhere, is still broadcasting intentionally. The developers have never commented on this. The signal just sits there, cycling, waiting for someone to notice it. What makes this particular Easter egg so compelling beyond just the discovery itself is that the frequency implied by the signal's characteristics maps to a real radio frequency. It appears to center around 7.3 MHz, which historically has been used by shortwave broadcasters and, yes, by numbers stations. Players who know their radio history immediately recognize the significance of that specific frequency choice. It is not a random number. It is a number with real-world context that implies the developers were drawing a deliberate line between our world and the world of Ark Raiders, suggesting that maybe the catastrophe in the game is not as fictional as we like to think, or at the very least that someone on the development team wanted players who knew enough to feel a chill of recognition. The second Easter egg builds on the first in a way that feels almost too intentional to be coincidental, and yet the community debated for weeks whether it actually connected. If you isolate the audio of the ambient sound in the underground tunnel network, that runs beneath the processing facility, the one most players use exclusively as a shortcut between extraction zones, you can hear something underneath the industrial hum of the machinery. It is layered just far enough below the surface audio that casual play never surfaces it. But players who run the game with high-quality headphones at higher volumes began noticing an irregularity in the rhythm of the sound. The mechanical drip of water, the occasional creak of settling metal, these are the sounds you expect. What you do not expect is a pattern hiding within those sounds. One community member, going by the handle Vex Meridian, spent 3 days mapping out the intervals between specific audio events in that tunnel and realized the dripping was not random. The intervals follow a recognizable pattern. It is Morse code. The Morse code sequence in the tunnel drips translates, with some interpretation, to a partial message. The community agreed on most of it fairly quickly once Vex Meridian's framework was established, and others began verifying independently. What they decoded was a fragment. The last relay is not silent. That is it. No further context, no indication of who sent it or when. Just that single fragment, embedded in what is supposed to be the ambient sound design of an industrial tunnel. The phrase points towards something, but the community has never fully agreed on what. One reading is that it refers to the communications relay station from Easter egg 1, suggesting that the signal we discussed earlier is the last relay in question, and that someone within the game's lore is acknowledging its existence through a hidden message. Another reading is more ominous, suggesting that a relay being not silent implies something is still receiving, still listening, even when no one is transmitting. The third Easter egg is the one that divided the community most sharply when it was first discovered, because half of players refused to believe it was intentional, and the other half became somewhat obsessed with it. In the deepest level of the underground sections accessible during specific mission types, there is a room that appears to serve as a former communications hub. Broken terminals line the walls, cables hang from collapsed ceiling panels, and the general aesthetic is consistent with the game's visual language of decay and abandonment. But players who spent time in that room, particularly after the audio from Easter egg 2 was decoded, began paying attention to the static coming from one specific broken terminal. This terminal has no visible screen output. It has no interactive prompt. Every other broken terminal in the game simply displays a dead screen or loops a corrupted boot sequence. This one plays static. And the static, when recorded and analysed, contains what several audio engineers in the community independently confirmed is a voice. The voice in the static is distorted to the point where transcription is almost impossible, and the community has produced at least 6 different versions of what it might be saying. The most widely agreed upon interpretation involves 2 words that appear consistently across multiple transcription attempts by different community members using different software. Those 2 words are "still here." Whether that refers to a person, a system, a faction, or something else entirely, the game does not clarify. The terminal plays its static on a loop. The voice buries its fragment in the noise, and the developers have not confirmed or denied any of it. What makes this land as genuinely unsettling, rather than just an interesting curiosity, is the context. The room is designed to look forgotten. Everything about it suggests a place where communication has stopped. And yet something in that room has not stopped. Something is still transmitting. Easter egg number 4 requires you to pay attention to the arc descent sequences, which most players treat as loading screens with extra visual flair. When the arc units drop from orbit, there is a cinematic pass that accompanies the event, showing the units entering the atmosphere and beginning their descent toward the map. These sequences have been dissected frame by frame by the visual analysis corner of the community, and what they found is a pattern in the behaviour of the descent trails themselves. Each arc unit leaves a plasma trail as it enters the atmosphere. These trails are procedurally generated and differ slightly each time. But within those trails, at specific points during specific missions that meet certain undocumented conditions, the trails form shapes that are not random. 3 specific trails, when captured in the same frame, during these special instances, resolve into a symbol. The symbol is not from any known real-world tradition. It appears to be original to the game, but it repeats. Every time these conditions are met, the same symbol appears. The community calls it the descent mark. The descent mark's significance is still actively debated. The visual analysts who found it have produced compelling overlays showing that the symbol matches imprecisely but recognizably a marking that appears on certain environmental objects in the underground sections of the map. This would imply that the ARC units and the underground infrastructure are somehow connected, which points toward a reading of the law suggesting the invasion was not random. If the same symbol appears both in the trajectory patterns of the invaders and in the built environment of the human underground, that is either a stunning coincidence of procedural generation, which some hold on to, or it is an intentional breadcrumb, suggesting that what looks like an attack from outside may have an inside component. The developers did adjust the visual parameters of the descent trails in one patch, which the community immediately flagged. The symbol still appears. Whatever it is, it survived deliberate revision. The 5th Easter egg in this chapter is the one I personally spent the most time on before I felt comfortable including it in this video, because it lives at the intersection of hidden content and genuine technical archaeology. Buried in the file system of the game's installation, in a folder path that most players would never navigate to manually, there exists an audio file that is not referenced by any other file in the game. It is not played during any mission. It is not connected to any event trigger. It simply sits in the directory, labeled with a file name that consists of a date, an underscore, and the letters FNL. Players who use modding tools and folder explorers have found the file and extracted it. It is 43 seconds long, and it contains a recording that sounds like a terminal readout being spoken aloud by a voice synthesis system. The voice is calm, institutional, the kind of automated voice you associate with an old intercom system in a government building. What the voice in that audio file says, once you adjust the playback speed from its native form, which is pitched unusually high, as if to obscure the content, is a mission briefing for an operation that does not appear anywhere in the game. The briefing references a location called Station Linden, which does not appear on any in-game map. It references a team designation that has no corresponding faction or squad in the game's known lore, and it ends with a phrase that has become one of the most analysed sentences in the entire Ark Raiders community. Proceed only if the second surface has been confirmed. No one knows what the second surface means. No one has found Station Linden. The file exists, the audio plays, the briefing describes something real within the game's internal development, and then it just stops. 43 seconds. The file is 43 seconds long, and there are 43 Easter eggs in this video. I do not think that is a coincidence, and neither did the community when someone pointed it out. The connection between these 5 audio Easter eggs is what convinced me to lead with them. They form a chain, a radio signal that should not exist, Morse code embedded in ambient dripping, a voice in static saying, "It is still here," a visual pattern that links the invaders to the infrastructure they are supposedly attacking, and a hidden audio file describing a mission to a location that does not officially exist. Individually, each of these is interesting. Together, they suggest a line of inquiry. They point toward the possibility that the world of Ark Raiders has a layer beneath the one players are shown, a layer where communication never stopped, where certain operations continued, where someone knew something the player characters do not. Whether that is the result of a coordinated development decision or a collection of independent secrets, that happen to resonate is something the game refuses to tell you. The audio team at Embark Studios, the developers of Ark Raiders, has a reputation for layering sound design in ways that reward careful listeners. This is not unique to their hidden content. Even the ambient soundscapes in publicly acknowledged areas of the game have a density and intentionality that you notice once you start paying attention. The fact that the hidden audio content follows the same principles of craft as the visible audio design suggests that whoever buried these secrets understood the medium they were working in. They knew that sound is the last thing most players think to analyze. They knew that the vast majority of people would walk through the tunnel, drive through the relay station, watch the descent sequence, and hear nothing unusual because they were not listening for it. The Easter eggs are hidden in plain sound. I want to dwell on Easter egg 5 for a moment longer before moving into the next chapter, because the 43-second duration of that hidden file is something that continues to genuinely unsettle me the more I sit with it. If you accept the reading that this number is intentional, the question immediately becomes, what is the relationship between the number 43 and the content of this video? I was not the first person to notice that the file's duration matched the count of Easter eggs this community has catalogued. That observation emerged organically in a thread after someone else had already compiled a working list of hidden discoveries. And when the count happened to land on 43, the thread got very quiet for a few minutes before people started reacting. The developers presumably knew when they were building this game how many secrets they were hiding. If this file is the anchor, if it is the developer's own count of their hidden content embedded in the installation, then that is a level of meta-awareness about their own Easter eggs that I have genuinely never seen before. What I will say definitively is this: the audio design across all 5 of these Easter eggs is consistent. The frequency choices, the way things are buried beneath surface noise, the use of distortion and pitch shifting as obscuring techniques, these are all consistent stylistic decisions. They read as the work of 1 or 2 people who knew exactly what they were doing and chose specific methods to make discovery difficult but not impossible. The community found all of this eventually. It took months for the full picture to emerge, and even now there are debates about specific translations and interpretations. But the finding of these signals, this steady uncovering of a layer of audio that was never meant to be easy, is one of the more remarkable examples of community archaeology I have seen in any game in recent memory. There is one detail I kept coming back to during my research for this chapter, and it concerns the number of loops the signal in Easter egg 1 completes before resetting. I mentioned that the cycle lasts 4 minutes and 17 seconds. That means in an 8-hour period the signal completes roughly 112 complete loops. 112 is not a number with obvious significance in the game's known lore. But players who cross-referenced it with the serial numbering system used on Ark units in the environmental storytelling found something interesting. Serial number 112 appears on a specific Ark unit found in a crashed state in a location that most players pass through without stopping. That unit is different from others around it in a way that is subtle. Its chassis is marked differently. Its damage pattern suggests it came down at a different angle than the units around it. And the community read of that crash site suggests this unit may have landed intentionally rather than as part of the main descent. Which loops back again to the idea that not everything falling from the sky is what it appears to be. The relay station itself, the location where Easter egg 1 lives, is worth discussing as a physical space within the game world because it rewards patient observation beyond just the audio discovery. The architecture of the station suggests it was built in 2 distinct phases. The older sections have a different material palette, rougher construction, and the kind of improvised engineering you see in structures built under pressure. The newer sections are cleaner, more deliberate, and bear hallmarks of construction that happened after the initial phase of the Ark invasion, which means someone was still building here after the world had already changed. Someone decided that this relay, specifically, was worth maintaining and expanding during the worst period of human history in the game's timeline. That speaks to a level of organizational continuity that the game's surface narrative doesn't fully account for. Moving toward the end of this first chapter, I want to reflect on what these 5 Easter eggs collectively suggest about the way Ark Raiders presents its world. The game's surface narrative is relatively transparent. You are a raider. You go to the surface. You fight Ark units. You extract resources. The world is broken, and humanity is underground, and the Ark are the threat. That is the story on the label. But these audio Easter eggs suggest a different story inside the container, one where communication never fully stopped, where certain individuals or factions maintain channels and operations that the broader population either did not know about or chose not to acknowledge. The signal at 7.3 MHz is not being broadcast for everyone. It is being broadcast for someone specific. And the 43-second audio file in a folder nobody is supposed to open was not put there for players to find easily. It was put there for someone who would know to look. The patience required to discover these Easter eggs is itself meaningful. Games often hide content in ways that require puzzle-solving skills or specific gameplay achievements. These audio secrets require something different. They require the willingness to slow down, to stop treating the game as a series of objectives to complete, and to inhabit the world with a kind of receptive attention that gameplay systems actively discourage. You cannot be in combat and hear the Morse code. You cannot be rushing an extraction and notice the static voice. These secrets were designed for a player who is not playing the game in the conventional sense. They are designed for someone who has decided to live in this world for a moment rather than conquer it. I find that to be a genuinely interesting design philosophy. To close this chapter, I want to return to something simple. The phrase decoded from the tunnel audio. The last relay is not silent. Whatever the intended meaning within the game's lore, the phrase lands differently now that we know about the hidden audio file, the repeating signal, the voice in the static. The last relay is not silent because these Easter eggs collectively demonstrate that someone kept the systems running, someone kept the signals going. Whether that is a character within the fiction or the developers themselves, sending a message to the community through the game's own hidden layer is a question this video cannot answer. But it is a question worth sitting with as we move into the next collection of secrets, because everything that follows builds on the foundation these audio Easter eggs establish. The world of Ark Raiders is louder than it appears. You just have to learn how to listen to it. Chapter 2. Written in the Walls. Easter egg number 6 lives in a part of the game that players visit constantly but rarely examine closely, which is precisely why it took so long to find. The walls of Sector C, the designation used by the community for the eastern residential block of the underground complex, are covered in graffiti. Most of it is what you would expect from a game depicting underground survivors: crude symbols, territorial markings, maintenance notations left by facility workers. The visual noise of all that marking on the walls is itself a form of camouflage. When everything is written, nothing stands out. But a community member called Dawnrise Actual spent several sessions photographing, or more precisely screenshotting, every visible surface in Sector C and then organising the results chronologically based on the style and apparent age of the markings. What emerged from that organisational effort was not a random collection of survival graffiti. It was a timeline. The graffiti in Sector C, when organised in the sequence Dawnrise Actual established, tells a story that runs parallel to the game's known history and extends beyond it in both directions. The earliest markings distinguished by a particular style of paint application, that suggests spray cans rather than markers or brushes predate the Ark invasion by what contextual clues suggest is several years. These early marks are practical. They notate waterline locations, emergency supply caches, maintenance schedules. They are the markings of people who were preparing these tunnels for habitation long before the invasion began. That detail is significant because the game's surface narrative implies the underground infrastructure was an emergency response. These markings suggest it was not. Someone was preparing for what was coming well in advance. The middle layer of graffiti, which the contextual timeline places during the initial years of the invasion, shifts in character dramatically. The practical notations give way to more emotional marking. Names appear frequently, presumably of people who were in these tunnels at the time. There are what appear to be memorial markings, rough sketches that function as grave markers for individuals who died during the underground transition period. There is also, appearing several times in slightly different handwriting suggesting multiple authors, a phrase that becomes increasingly central to this chapter's Easter eggs. The phrase is, "Remember Oslo." It appears first in small careful lettering near the ceiling of a corridor that connects two residential blocks, and then it appears again and again, growing in size and urgency with each repetition as the timeline of the graffiti progresses. Before we get to the meaning of Oslo, let's look at Easter egg 7, which is considerably more playful than the graffiti timeline, and reads as a classic developer signature move. Hidden within the geometry of the loading dock area, specifically on the sides of standardized cargo crates stacked in configurations that players often use for cover, there are initials carved into the wood. Not painted, not stenciled, carved, the way someone might idly carve their name into a school desk while waiting for class to end. The initials appear on crates in specific dock configurations, and crucially, they do not repeat. Each set of initials is unique, and the community has catalogued 11 distinct sets across multiple loading dock areas, cross-referenced with publicly known information about the development team at Embark Studios. 7 of those 11 initial sets correspond to names of team members credited in the game's credits under environmental art or level design. The other 4 initial sets do not correspond to anyone in the public credits. The community spent time trying to match them against other Embark staff, against contractors who had worked with the studio, against LinkedIn profiles and industry databases. 2 of the unmatched sets remain completely unidentified. One appears to correspond to a tester credited in a previous Embark project, and the 4th, the one that has generated the most discussion, appears alongside a small additional marking, a symbol that looks like a stylized compass rose. Compass imagery has appeared in other parts of the game's hidden content, which we will encounter again later. The community's tentative read is that the 4th unmatched set of initials belongs to someone who contributed to the game's development in a capacity not reflected in the public credits, possibly during an early development phase before the current team configuration was established. Who carved their name and a compass into a digital crate, and why they went uncredited is something only Embark can answer. Easter egg 8 is one of the most directly readable pieces of hidden content in the entire game, and yet it took months to find because of where it is located. In a section of the underground complex that serves as what the environmental storytelling suggests was a former administrative area, there is a wall that has been partially collapsed and then shored up with improvised supports. The collapse and repair is consistent with the general aesthetic of the space and does not draw attention. But if you navigate around the supporting structure, which requires moving through a gap that exists but is not intuitive to approach, you find the original surface of the wall preserved behind the collapsed debris. And on that original surface, in lettering that was done carefully and with evident intent, are the words, "They came from below." The positioning of this inscription is important. It faces inward, toward the interior of the complex, not outward toward the surface. Whoever wrote it was not warning people about what was coming from outside. They were describing something that originated from within the underground structure itself. The community's reading here diverges significantly. One interpretation holds that below is relative to the writer's position at the time, possibly someone who was on an upper level of the underground complex, looking down at something that emerged from a lower level. Another interpretation reads the phrase more literally and more unsettlingly, that something came from underground, something that was already there before the Ark arrived, something that the invasion may have disturbed or revealed or interacted with. This connects to other lore threads that suggest the underground infrastructure in Ark Raiders was not built in response to the invasion, but was already present and had been used for purposes the game does not fully disclose. The 9th Easter egg brings us back to the theme of encoded location data, which appears multiple times across Ark Raiders' hidden content in ways that feel connected. In the former administrative area, not far from the "They came from below" inscription, there is a workbench that functions as a prop with no interactive capability. Standard environmental furniture. But players who zoomed in on the surface of the workbench noticed something scratched into the material, faint enough to look like ordinary wear damage at casual inspection distance, clear enough to read when you know it is there. The scratches form coordinate notation. It is a set of geographic coordinates, formatted in a system that matches the coordinate notation used on in-game maps, but pointing to a location that does not correspond to any marked zone or accessible area on any version of the game's map. Community members attempted to extrapolate what terrain feature might exist at those coordinates if they were applied to the game world's geography. The result was inconclusive, partly because the game's map is not to a consistent scale, and partly because certain areas of the map appear to have been deliberately obscured or left deliberately vague in the environmental storytelling. What the community did agree on is that the coordinates, if valid, point to a location that is underground rather than on the surface, at a depth that would place it significantly below the lowest accessible level of the underground complex. Whatever is at those coordinates, if anything, is not somewhere the player can reach through normal gameplay. Whether it was ever intended to be accessible, or whether it represents content that was cut before release, or whether it is a pure lore artifact pointing towards something in the narrative that has never been shown, nobody knows. Easter egg 10 is where the chapter's central mystery fully arrives. The phrase "Remember Oslo" that began appearing in the Sector C graffiti timeline reoccurs throughout the game in ways that are too widespread and too varied to be atmospheric decoration. It appears in the graffiti, yes, but also in text visible on certain documents in the administrative section, in a corrupted terminal entry that is mostly illegible but preserves those two words clearly, and most strikingly, in a location that should be completely isolated from any human presence. Carved into the outer surface of a structural support beam in a section of underground tunnel that the game's environmental storytelling indicates has been sealed and untouched since before the invasion began. Someone went into a section of tunnel that was already being prepared for long-term sealing and wrote "Remember Oslo" on a beam that would then be entombed behind concrete and infrastructure for an unknown number of years. The meaning of Oslo has been the subject of the most sustained investigative effort of any mystery in Ark Raiders' hidden content. Oslo is a real city, and the community has explored every angle of what that might mean within the game's lore. The game does not reference Oslo in any dialogue, mission briefing, or accessible lore document. The city simply does not appear in the game's acknowledged world. But the phrase "Remember Oslo" implies that something happened there, something significant enough that survivors felt the need to memorialize it across multiple locations, multiple time periods of the graffiti record, and at least one location that suggests foreknowledge of what was coming. Whatever Oslo represents in Ark Raiders lore, it happened before the invasion was public knowledge, and people who knew about it considered it important enough to preserve in stone, and paint and scratched metal in the dark. The community's best attempts to reconstruct what Oslo might mean within the game's fiction have produced several theories. The most widely circulated theory holds that Oslo was the site of an early Ark landing, or possibly a first contact event that was suppressed from public knowledge. The remember in the phrase suggests a collective mourning, the kind of memorial language you use for a tragedy rather than a celebration. If an early Ark encounter in Oslo resulted in casualties that were covered up, the phrase would function as both a memorial and accusation, a reminder to people who knew the truth that the world had already had a warning before the full invasion began. This theory connects to other Easter eggs we will encounter later in the video that suggest the invasion timeline in the game's official lore may not be the complete picture. A secondary theory about Oslo takes a different approach. Some community members point to the way the phrase is written in its earliest appearances, specifically in the Sector C graffiti, and note that the handwriting in those early instances appears almost instructional rather than emotional, less like a memorial, more like a reminder of procedure. In this reading, Oslo might be the name of a protocol or a facility rather than a city, and remember Oslo would be telling someone how to do something rather than asking them to grieve someone. The connection to the carved inscription behind the collapsed debris, where someone who was preparing the tunnels for sealing felt it important to physically write this reminder into the structure, supports a procedural reading. Whatever the Oslo Protocol is, you would want it embedded in the walls rather than in documents that could be lost or destroyed. The physical distribution of the Remember Oslo appearances across the game world is itself meaningful. If you map out every confirmed location where the phrase appears, what you get is not a random scatter. The locations form a rough path through the underground complex, one that starts in the older sections and moves toward areas that correspond to deeper and more restricted access. It is not a perfect line, and some community members dispute whether the pattern is intentional, given the limitations of what the game allows players to access. But the majority view is that the phrase was seeded along a route, possibly a route that leads somewhere, possibly a route that once connected 2 points within the underground complex that are now separated by collapsed or sealed sections. If you could follow the path of Remember Oslo markers to its end, you might find something. The visual vocabulary of the hidden graffiti content in Ark Raiders is worth pausing on as a craft observation before we continue. The environmental artists who built these spaces clearly thought carefully about how written marks age differently depending on the material they are applied to and the environmental conditions they are exposed to. The spray-painted marks in the older sections have a convincingly weathered quality that is distinct from the marker and ink marks in the more recent sections, which are distinct again from the carved inscriptions that have a permanence the painted marks lack. This attention to material differentiation is what allows the graffiti timeline to be reconstructed in the first place. If everything looked the same age, there would be no timeline to read. The fact that the timeline is readable is either a happy accident of careful environmental art or evidence that the artists intentionally designed the aging to enable exactly the kind of investigation the community has conducted. One detail from the graffiti timeline that has not received as much attention as Oslo, but that I find genuinely fascinating, is an image rather than text. Appearing once in a section of tunnel that the timeline places in the early invasion period is a careful drawing of what appears to be a compass. It is rendered with a level of precision that stands out from the surrounding graffiti, which is rougher and more hurried in character. The compass is pointing to something, or at least depicting the directional convention of a working compass, but the direction it is indicating within the game world is not north as defined by the game's maps. It points toward the lower levels of the underground complex. Someone took the time to draw a careful, precise compass pointing down, in the middle of a period of crisis, when the surrounding marks suggest people were frightened and in a hurry. And that compass connects, the community noticed, to the symbol carved alongside the unknown initials in Easter egg 7. There is an argument to be made that the hidden textual content in Ark Raiders, everything we have discussed in this chapter, constitutes a second narrative running alongside the game's primary story. The primary story is about the surface, about raiding, about extracting resources from an invaded world. The second narrative, legible only to people willing to read the walls, is about the underground itself, about what was built there before the invasion, about what people knew and feared and remembered in the dark. The graffiti timeline tells this second story in fragments, and the Remember Oslo thread is its through line. Where it ultimately leads is something this chapter cannot resolve, because the game does not resolve it. But the evidence on the walls suggests that, whatever Oslo was, it is the key to understanding why the underground complex exists in the form it does, and why certain sections were prepared, sealed, and marked with instructions long before anyone officially knew an invasion was coming. The written content continues to reward close reading in smaller details that do not rise to the level of standalone Easter eggs, but contribute to the texture of the hidden layer. Near the workbench with the coordinate scratches, there is a stack of papers that serves as a prop. Most of the text on these papers is illegible blurring, the kind of placeholder texture work that is standard in environmental art. But one paper near the top of the stack has 2 lines of legible text, visible at the right camera angle. The lines read, Phase 3 confirmed. Proceed to depth 7. No context, no header, no signature, just 2 lines of instruction on a prop that most players would never think to examine at close range. Depth 7 is not a designation that appears anywhere in the game's accessible architecture, but it rhymes with the coordinates scratched into the workbench, pointing to something beneath the lowest accessible level. The administrative section of the underground complex is, taken as a whole, the most information-dense space in the game for hidden content purposes. It is also the space most players spend the least time in, because it offers no particular gameplay benefit. There are no resource caches worth extracting, no enemy configurations worth farming, no mission objectives that bring you there. The space exists purely for environmental storytelling, which means the hidden content it contains was placed there, knowing that only the most attentive and lore-focused players would find it. The choice to concentrate this much hidden narrative in a space that competitive or objective-focused players never visit is a design decision that speaks to a particular view of what the game's hidden layer is for. It is not for everyone. It is specifically for the people who would look. Chapter 2 ends where the graffiti timeline ends, in a section of the complex where the marks become sparser and more urgent. The final entries in the timeline, the ones the contextual evidence places most recently in the game's history, have a different character from everything before them. They are not memorials or instructions or declarations. They are questions. One wall near a sealed corridor has, in handwriting that matches the most recent layer of the timeline, a single line. Is anyone reading this? Not is anyone reading this with a question mark. The question mark is absent, which the community has read as either an oversight or a deliberate stylistic choice suggesting exhaustion, someone who has given up expecting an answer. Someone wrote a message on a wall in a game, and the message asks whether the message is being received, and then went quiet. And then, several months after the game released, a community member finally read it. The relay, you might say, is not silent. Chapter 3. Phantom Faces. The 10th week after Ark Raiders released was when Easter egg 11 surfaced in the community, and the timing felt strange to a lot of people because by that point most players had concluded that the game's hidden content was primarily audio-based, following the discoveries we covered in Chapter 1. The idea that there was a visual hidden layer of comparable depth had not really entered the conversation. And then someone posted a screenshot of a loose vent panel in a utility corridor, specifically the kind of vent panel that is a common environmental prop across countless games, and behind the panel was a photograph. A physical photograph, a prop photograph obviously, rendered as an in-game texture. But one that nobody had noticed in weeks of play, because you have to physically remove the vent panel by interacting with it in a way that serves no gameplay purpose, and the vent panel sits in a corridor that again offers no gameplay incentive to visit. The photograph behind the vent panel shows what appears to be a group of people standing in front of a structure. The image quality within the game's rendering renders the specific faces difficult to read, but the composition is clearly intentional. It is posed formal, the kind of group photograph taken to commemorate an occasion. The structure behind the group is not one that appears anywhere on the game's accessible maps, but its architecture suggests underground construction, and the clothing visible on the figures suggests a period that predates the Ark invasion by enough years to be significant. Community members who analysed the image spent considerable time on two details: the structure in the background, which appears to have signage visible, that has been deliberately blurred within the texture, and one figure in the group who is not looking at the camera. Everyone else faces forward. This one figure looks to the side, towards something outside the photograph's frame. Whether that is atmospheric detail or intentional misdirection is not something the game confirms. Easter egg 12 sits in a location that most players have been to many times without looking at the correct surface. In the commander's quarters of the main hub facility, a room that players visit during certain early missions and then largely forget about, there is a wall that contains what passes at quick inspection as standard frame decoration. The game uses framed art as environmental props throughout the facility, mostly abstract imagery consistent with an institutional aesthetic. But one of the frames in the commander's quarters contains something different. A portrait, not abstract art, a rendered face, clearly specific rather than generic, painted in a style that suggests pre-invasion era production. The face belongs to someone. Whether that someone is a character within the game's lore, a real person whose likeness was used with permission, or a pure invention of the development team is not documented anywhere. The portrait is painted in a style that the community's art historians placed as consistent with formal commissioned portraiture from roughly 50 to 60 years before the game's setting. The figure in the portrait wears clothing that suggests professional or academic context, nothing military or governmental. The expression is neutral, the kind of neutrality that formal portraiture often requires, but that communicates something about the subject when you consider where it has been placed. This portrait is in the commander's quarters of a military command facility, presumably placed there by the commander or by whoever furnished the space. The subject of the portrait is not in military or governmental dress. Who gets a civilian academic portrait hung in a military commander's quarters? The community's answer, tentative but persistent, is someone important enough that the commander wanted to remember them. The connection between the photograph behind the vent panel and the portrait in the commander's quarters is not proven, but the community has made a compelling circumstantial case. In the photograph, one figure stands slightly apart from the rest, positioned at the edge of the group in a way that suggests they joined the photograph late or was included somewhat reluctantly. The framing and apparent gender presentation of that peripheral figure is consistent with the portrait subject, within the limits of what the game's rendering allows. If they are the same person, then we have a civilian academic who appears in a commemorative photograph of what looks like an underground construction team and whose portrait hangs in a military commander's quarters. Someone whose relationship to both the underground project and the military facility deserves a story that the game has chosen not to tell directly. Easter egg 13 is possibly the most difficult one in this entire video to actually witness, because it requires a specific weather state that occurs unpredictably, and most players who have encountered it did not recognize what they were seeing because they had no reason to be looking in the right place at the right time. During certain storm events on the surface, when visibility drops below a specific threshold and the lighting conditions meet requirements that the community has attempted to reverse engineer from multiple recorded instances, a silhouette becomes visible on the horizon of the playable surface area. It is not a hostile entity. The game's threat detection systems do not flag it. It does not move with the behavior patterns of ARC units. It is simply a humanoid silhouette standing at the limit of the visual distance, unaffected by the storm, present for several seconds before the weather conditions shift, and it disappears. The silhouette is roughly human proportioned. The community's analysis of its apparent height and build relative to the environmental geometry places it within normal human range, which immediately distinguishes it from ARC units, which tend toward proportions that deviate from human norms in clearly non-human ways. The figure, if it is a figure, stands still. It does not react to the player's presence. It does not animate in ways that suggest AI behavior. And then it's gone. Players who have recorded encounters with this phenomenon have attempted to reach the location where it was visible before the weather shifts, but the distance is too great. By the time you reach the horizon point, the storm has changed and there's nothing there. Whether this is a ghost model, a residual graphical artifact from a cut narrative moment, or something intentional placed exactly where players could never reach it, no one has been able to determine. Easter egg 14 is the reflection Easter egg, and it generated the most genuine excitement of any visual discovery in the game's first year, partly because it is the kind of thing that is so obviously there once you see it that you cannot believe it took months to find. The large cooling tanks in the industrial section of the underground complex contain a fluid with reflective properties. Players use these tanks as cover, as navigation landmarks, as spatial reference points. Almost nobody looks into them. If you approach one of the larger tanks from a specific angle, in a specific section of the industrial zone, and look at the fluid surface, you see the reflection of the ceiling above. The ceiling, reflected, shows the standard industrial architecture of the underground complex, except that, in the reflection, one panel of the ceiling is different. The reflected ceiling panel shows a different texture than the actual ceiling panel above it. The reflection does not match the source material. The discrepancy in the cooling tank reflection is small enough that it requires deliberate, close examination and the right angle to observe, which is why it survived months of gameplay without being reported. When the community began comparing screenshots of the discrepant reflection to other textures in the game, they found a match. The texture visible in the reflection appears to be a variant of the texture used on the sealed corridor walls, the sections of the underground complex that the environmental storytelling marks as off-limits and long undisturbed. The ceiling above the cooling tank, when you look at it directly, is standard industrial paneling. Its reflection shows something that should be sealed and inaccessible. One reading of this is a simple graphical error where the wrong texture was mapped to a reflection. Another reading is that the reflection is showing you something accurate, that the space above the ceiling panel is not standard industrial infrastructure, but instead connects to a sealed section. The real ceiling is a false floor. Easter egg 15 is the last entry in this chapter, and the one that has produced the most sustained disagreement about whether it constitutes an Easter egg or simply an ambitious graphical glitch. At the boundary of the extraction zone, the designated area players must reach to complete a surface run. There is a point at which the game's rendering systems transition from full detail to reduced detail presentation of the world. This is a standard optimization technique, and players never notice it because there is no reason to look away from the extraction zone during an extraction. But players who have deliberately moved to the boundary and looked outward, away from the extraction zone and toward the transition point, have reported seeing something in the distance, a figure, humanoid, standing at the exact point where the detailed rendering ends and the lower detail representation begins, which means the figure is visible for only a moment before the rendering threshold resolves it into nothing. It appears in the gap between levels of detail. It exists in the transition. The community spent a long time arguing about whether this was intentional. The strongest argument for intentionality is the consistency of the reports. Multiple players, in multiple sessions at the same extraction zone, have described seeing the same thing in the same location. The strongest argument against intentionality is that transition artifacts are a known feature of this type of rendering pipeline, and what looks like a figure might be a coincidental arrangement of geometry that resolves into something humanoid before the LOD transition corrects it. The compromise position, which most community members have settled on, is that even if the specific appearance is a rendering artifact, its consistency across sessions suggests it may be connected to intentional geometry placed near the transition zone. Something is there, whether it was put there to be seen or is simply the ghost of a mesh existing in an unrendered space, is a question the game leaves unresolved. Taking the Phantom Face Easter eggs together, what they collectively build is a sense that the world of Ark Raiders is occupied in ways the player is never directly shown. The photograph, the portrait, the storm silhouette, the reflection that doesn't match its source, the figure at the rendering threshold. Each one places a presence just outside the player's reach. You can get close to these moments. You can record them. You can analyze them, but you cannot interact with them. They are not enemies to fight or NPCs to talk to. They are simply present. The design philosophy, if these are all intentional, seems interested in creating a sense that the player is not alone in this world in ways that go beyond the game's acknowledged inhabitants. There are people here the game does not introduce you to. There are faces that belong to stories you are not being told. And the more carefully you look, the more of them you find. The portrait in the commander's quarters has one additional detail that I saved for this point in the chapter, because it works better after everything else has been established. At the very bottom of the portrait's frame, visible only if you get close enough to inspect it, in a way the game does not obviously reward, there is text. It is small, rendered at a resolution that makes it barely legible, and the community needed several comparison screenshots and some image upscaling to read it with confidence. The text appears to be a name and a date. The name is partially legible. The surname appears to be Lindqvist. The date is fully legible, and it predates the game's acknowledged Ark invasion timeline by 11 years. A portrait of someone named Lindqvist, dated 11 years before the invasion, hanging in a military commander's quarters in an underground facility that the graffiti timeline suggests was under preparation years before the invasion, became public. The portrait's subject had enough significance to be remembered formally, in paint, by someone with enough resources to commission a formal portrait, at a time when the underground future was not yet officially acknowledged. That is a story. The game just hasn't told it yet. Chapter 4. Numbers that don't add up. Easter egg 16 is the kind of discovery that makes you go back and question everything you thought you knew about the game's timeline, which is a response the developers may have specifically intended. If you read the mission briefings carefully, all of them, not just the ones relevant to your current objective, you will find a date discrepancy that is consistent enough to be deliberate. The briefings are dated using the game's internal calendar system, which is presented as a continuous timeline from a specific anchor date. Most briefings are consistent with this system, but a set of briefings connected to a particular mission chain, the one players associate with the Deep Facility Access storyline, carry dates that do not fit the established sequence. They are dated from a different anchor point, one that places the events described in those briefings approximately 4 years earlier than where the main timeline would put them. The 4-year gap in the mission briefing dates is not explained anywhere in the game's accessible lore. Players who noticed it initially assumed it was a development error, the kind of continuity mistake that makes it into shipping code when a studio is managing large amounts of internally authored content. But the gap is consistent across every briefing in that chain, which argues against careless error. A consistent discrepancy across multiple documents suggests either a systemic calendaring difference, meaning those briefings were written by a faction that uses a different dating convention, or an intentional narrative signal, meaning the events described in those briefings actually did happen 4 years earlier than the main timeline, and the discrepant dates are accurate rather than wrong. The second reading implies that certain operations began significantly earlier than the game's surface timeline acknowledges, which connects again to the pre-invasion preparation theme running through the earlier Easter eggs. Easter egg 17 brings us to the serial numbers stamped on ARC units within the game's environmental storytelling. Crashed, disabled, and displayed ARC units throughout the world carry identifying stamps that serve an aesthetic purpose. They make the machines look manufactured rather than mythological. But a community analyst with a background in data systems began cataloguing these serial numbers and noticed that they are not random. Serial numbers on manufactured goods follow patterns determined by the manufacturing system. Facility codes, batch identifiers, sequential production numbers. The ARC unit serial numbers in the game follow a legible structure once you identify the pattern, and within that structure, certain units carry stamps that deviate from the expected format. The deviations are not errors, they are consistent with an alternative encoding, and when you extract and order the deviating characters, they spell something. The message encoded in the deviating ARC unit serial numbers required the input of dozens of community members comparing notes across multiple game sessions before it could be confidently reconstructed. The full community effort took roughly 6 weeks. What the serial number anomalies spell out, when the deviating characters are extracted in the order determined by the unit's physical placement within the game world rather than their numbering sequence, is assembled before arrival. 2 words, a pause implied by the structure of the encoding, and 2 more words. The community's reading of this phrase is that it describes the ARC units themselves, that they were assembled, as in manufactured or constructed, before their arrival on Earth, which seems self-evident until you consider the implication more carefully. If the ARC units were assembled before arrival, someone made them, and the encoding of that information in the serial numbers suggests that whoever made them anticipated they would be studied, analysed, and decoded by someone with enough knowledge to look. Easter egg 18 is one that the community has named the reset clock, and it is strange enough that I am going to describe exactly what it involves before offering any interpretation. In a specific terminal in the monitoring station above the main underground complex, there is a counter displayed among several other system readouts. Most of the readouts are either static numbers or values that change continuously with gameplay state. This counter appears static at first, but it is not static, it is counting down. The countdown runs in what appears to be real time, seconds ticking away at a rate consistent with the game's internal clock. Players who watched it long enough discovered that it resets at a specific value. The counter counts down to 0 and then immediately resets to its starting value and begins again. The starting value, and therefore the duration of each complete cycle, is 43 seconds. The same number as the hidden audio file from Chapter 1. 43 seconds, counting down, resetting, looping, in a terminal that most players walk past without examining. The reset clock has produced 2 main interpretive streams in the community. The first is relatively simple and treats the 43-second cycle as a direct developer reference, a signature embedded in the game that nods to a specific number the development team chose as their hidden through line. This interpretation holds that 43 is the developer's number, appearing in the audio file's length, in this countdown timer, and potentially elsewhere as a kind of authorial signature across the hidden content. The second interpretation engages more seriously with the in-world meaning of a countdown timer that resets at 43 seconds and asks what, within the game's fiction, would operate on that cycle. The monitoring station is designed to track surface activity, arc movement, resource fluctuations. Why would any system in such a station cycle on a 43-second loop? The community has not found a satisfying in-world answer, which some read as evidence that this one is purely a developer signature rather than narrative content. Easter egg 19 requires patience and record-keeping to identify because it is distributed across multiple objects rather than concentrated in a single location. The production date stamps visible on manufactured items throughout the game's world, from food packaging to equipment casings to construction materials, follow a pattern that the community began documenting when the serial number Easter egg was established. The assumption was that if one set of numerical data had been intentionally designed as an encoding, other numerical data might warrant similar scrutiny. The production dates, when filtered for anomalies using the same methodology that revealed the serial number message, yield a different finding. They form a timeline. The anomalous production dates, extracted from their respective objects and ordered chronologically, document a sequence of events in the game's past that does not appear in any official lore document. The timeline documented by the production date stamps is fragmented, as you would expect from information encoded across dozens of separate props distributed across a large game world. But the community has reconstructed enough of it to establish a rough sequence. The earliest anomalous dates document what appears to be the establishment of something, a facility, or a project. Later dates document operational milestones. And the final anomalous dates in the sequence, the ones with the most recent production stamps, are associated with items found in the most recently constructed sections of the underground complex. They document something ending, a project concluding or a phase completing before the invasion began. Whatever was being built and operated in the underground space had a complete arc of establishment, operation, and conclusion that happened independently of the Ark invasion. The invasion may have interrupted whatever came next, but the project had already finished its intended purpose before the Ark arrived. Easter egg 20 is the most geographically specific hidden discovery in this chapter, and the one that connects most directly to the coordinate scratches we encountered in Chapter 2. The map of the game's accessible surface area contains marked zones, objective points, extraction zones, and resource locations. These are the map's official content, but players who scrutinize the game's map interface at maximum zoom in regions that have no official map markers found an anomaly in a grid sector that the game designates with a coordinate label but has no accessible terrain. The sector appears to exist in the navigation system, which is why it has a coordinate label, but it does not correspond to any playable area. Players who attempted to navigate to the coordinates using those labels found that the map simply ends before they get there, with an environmental boundary that prevents access. The sector is labelled but empty, acknowledged by the navigation system, but sealed off from physical access. The coordinates of this blank sector match within the precision limits of the game's two different coordinate systems, the scratches on the workbench from Chapter 2. Someone scratched coordinates onto a workbench in an administrative area that point to a sector on the official navigation map that exists as a label without content. The navigation system knows about this place. The map acknowledges its existence as a grid location, but it is sealed. The workbench scratch tells you where to go, and the map tells you the destination is real but unreachable. This is either a setup for future content, a reference to content that was cut, or a deliberate lore decision to indicate that there are parts of the game's world that the player cannot access for reasons the game declines to explain. In any of these readings, the connection between the workbench coordinates and the blank map sector transforms what seemed like a simple coordinate scratch into a genuine pointer, a direction that the game's own navigation system confirms leads somewhere. The numerical Easter eggs in Ark Raiders collectively do something that the other categories of hidden content do not do as directly. They create a framework for measurement. The 43-second cycle, the 43 Easter eggs, the 4-year date discrepancy, the serial number message, the production date timeline, the blank map sector. These are not impressionistic, they are specific. They point to concrete things. And the concreteness creates the possibility of falsification that more atmospheric Easter eggs do not offer. Either the serial numbers spell assembled before arrival, or they do not. Either the countdown timer resets at 43 seconds, or it does not. Either the workbench coordinates match the blank map sector, or they do not. The community can check these. And having checked them, having confirmed the specific claims with multiple independent verifications, the conclusion that this hidden content is intentional becomes very difficult to avoid. These are not vibes, these are numbers, and numbers like these do not arrange themselves by accident. I want to close this chapter with a reflection on the relationship between the number 43 as it appears across Ark Raiders' hidden content and the real-world numerology, if you can call it that, of the development process. Games have hidden content that uses numbers as signatures all the time. The most common form is a developer's favourite number or birthday embedded somewhere in the game. What is unusual about Ark Raiders is that if 43 is the signature number, it appears in places that require the number to carry weight within the fiction. A countdown timer that resets at your signature number feels arbitrary, but a countdown timer that resets at 43 seconds in a monitoring station that tracks Ark activity in a world where 43 hidden pieces of content are waiting to be found creates a texture of meaning that goes beyond signature. The number feels earned by context. It feels like the right number for this world, whatever that means. And the developers, whoever specifically embedded it, either had extraordinary aesthetic instinct or extraordinary luck. Both seem possible. Chapter 5. Objects out of place. Easter egg 21 is the one that made me stop and put down the controller, or at least the figurative equivalent of that for a PC game, when I first heard about it. The military command center in Ark Raiders serves a clear narrative function. It is a place of authority, of coordinated defense, of institutional seriousness. The aesthetic is consistent throughout. Maps, communications equipment, tactical displays, the tools of organized military response to a catastrophic threat. Nothing in that space is soft or domestic or small scale. Except for one object in a corner of the central command room that players pass through on certain mission types, placed at the base of a structural column in a position that the camera angle during normal gameplay never quite points at directly. A child's toy. A small rendered figure of an animal, the kind of simple toy that a very young child would carry. It sits there in the corner of the command center, among all the tactical seriousness, and the game provides no explanation. The child's toy has generated an enormous amount of discussion precisely because its contrast with its environment is so total. Toys of this kind appear in games all the time as markers of loss, specifically the implied loss of a child, and Ark Raiders may be using it in exactly that conventional way. But the community's more interesting investigations have focused on trying to identify what the toy depicts. At the resolution the game renders it, the figure is not immediately identifiable as any specific animal. Players who analysed the geometry concluded that it most closely resembles, imprecisely, a bear, a small rendered bear in the corner of a military command centre. If the toy belonged to a child, whose child? The commanding officer? A staff member who brought a small piece of home to an institutional space, and then, at some point, left it behind or lost the reason to carry it? The game does not say, The toy simply exists in its impossible context and lets the viewer project whatever story they need onto it. Easter egg 22 is the pre-invasion calendar, and its significance lies almost entirely in the specific date it displays. Throughout the game's indoor environments, wall calendars appear as props, and most of them are either completely abstracted, showing grid patterns without legible month or date information, or frozen at arbitrary dates that carry no apparent significance. One calendar in the supply management area of the residential quarter is different. It is frozen like the others, showing a specific date frozen at the point where someone stopped marking days off. But the date it is frozen on is notable. It is not within the invasion period. The date displayed falls before the invasion, according to the game's established timeline, in a period that contextual lore suggests was still nominally peacetime. Someone stopped marking this calendar in the middle of what should have been a normal time. They stopped before the world ended. They either knew what was coming, or something happened to them before the world ended that was just as complete. The calendar's stop date does not correspond to any officially named event in Ark Raiders lore. It does not match a mission date or a briefing timestamp, but it does match within a narrow margin of discrepancy that the community debated, the earliest anomalous production date stamp from Easter egg 19, the one that the production timeline reconstruction places at the establishment of the underground project. If those two dates are the same event, then the calendar was stopped on the day the underground project was formally begun. Someone who worked in the supply management area was connected to that project or was informed of it on that day, and the significance of the day was enough to make them stop marking time in the ordinary way. The calendar is not a record of a normal day. It is the record of the day something changed. Easter egg 23 is the coffee mug, which sounds trivial and is anything but. In the break room of the administrative section, a space so ordinary in its design that players cycle through it quickly without pausing, there is a mug on a counter. The mug has a logo on it. Logos on props in games are usually either invented purely for aesthetic texture or recognizable parodies of real brands. This logo is neither. It is a specific visual design, rendered clearly enough to photograph and analyze, that the community identified as belonging to a corporation that appears in the game's lore, but is never fully described. The corporation's name is only partially legible on the mug, but the community's cross-referencing with other logo fragments visible elsewhere in the environment established a full name: Nordvik Systems. Nordvik Systems does not appear in Ark Raiders credits, marketing materials, or any officially released lore documents. It is not a real company, but it appears on the mug, and once the community was looking for it, they found it in other places, on an equipment casing in the industrial section, on a storage container in the loading dock, and most significantly, in a single corrupted line of the terminal data that preserves only fragments of readable text. The terminal fragment associated with Nordvik Systems is partial enough that its full meaning is not recoverable, but what is legible suggests that Nordvik Systems was involved in the underground infrastructure project, a corporation that does not appear in the game's acknowledged history, associated with the construction of facilities that the surface narrative treats as emergency infrastructure, with a logo on a coffee mug in a break room that someone used every day in what was once a normal working life. Nordvik Systems built something. The game has chosen not to tell you what. Easter egg 24 is perhaps the most emotionally resonant object in this chapter, and possibly in the entire video, because of what it implies about the people who lived in these spaces before the player arrived. In one of the lower residential areas of the underground complex, in a room that the environmental storytelling presents as once inhabited family quarters, there is a planter box attached to a wall shelf. The planter box contains soil, and in the soil, rendered with evident care by whoever built this environmental prop, are small green shoots, seeds that were planted at some point and then grew in the absence of whoever planted them. The lights in the room, presumably connected to some backup power system, are still on. The plants, without anyone to water them, have survived, or at least this is the fiction the game presents. Small green things growing in an abandoned room because someone, at some point, had enough hope for the future to plant something. The planted seeds become an Easter egg, rather than merely a touching prop detail, because of what the community found when they examined the species. The plant renders are not generic. They are specific enough that players with horticultural knowledge identified them as consistent with a particular variety of plant that is, in the context of a sealed underground environment with artificial lighting, practically useful rather than decorative. Someone planted something that would grow in this specific environment and produce something edible. This was not an act of sentiment, it was an act of planning. Someone prepared this room not just for shelter but for food production, on a scale that suggests long-term thinking rather than emergency improvisation. The seeds are hope encoded as practicality, and the fact that they are still growing means the preparation worked, even though the people who prepared it are no longer there to benefit. Easter egg 25 closes this chapter with a chess set. In the commander's quarters, near the portrait from chapter 3, there is a table with a chess set arranged mid-game. This is, again, a common game prop. The unfinished chess game suggesting interrupted lives, strategic minds, civilized pastimes, persisting in extraordinary circumstances. But this chess set is different from most gaming chess props, in that the position on the board is not random. It is a real position, a specific chess endgame configuration that a community member with a background in competitive chess immediately recognized. The position on the board is not just a legal chess position, it is a famous position, one from a historically significant match played in the late 20th century, a match that has been analysed extensively in chess literature for its complexity and the specific endgame technique it demonstrated. The famous match represented on the chessboard in the commander's quarters is not a minor reference. It is a specific, deliberate choice to recreate one specific moment from one specific game. The game in question was a match between a human player and an early artificial intelligence chess system, one of the early high-profile demonstrations of machine intelligence outperforming human expertise in a domain previously considered a human stronghold. The position on the board represents the moment just before the human player resigned. Someone, the commander presumably, set up a chessboard in their quarters with that specific position. One side is losing to the other. The losing side's pieces are in the configuration of the human player from that historical match. The chessboard is a commentary. The commander was living in a world where something not human had descended from above and was winning, and they decorated their quarters with the moment before a human resigned to a machine. The objects in Chapter 5 collectively construct a portrait of the people who inhabited these spaces before the game's present moment. The toy suggests a child or the memory of one. The stopped calendar suggests a moment of knowledge that changed everything. The coffee mug from a vanished corporation suggests an ordinary working life connected to something extraordinary. The planted seed suggests someone who planned for a very long future with quiet determination. The chess set suggests a commander who is thinking about what it means to lose to something that is not a person. These are not law documents. They are not transmissions or codes or signals. They are just objects left in rooms telling you about the people who left them. The game's hidden layer includes not just mysteries and codes, but this quieter, more intimate register. Objects that speak about who these people were when no one was watching. They are the most human things in a world that has largely been abandoned by humans, and they reward the kind of attention that slow play and genuine curiosity make possible. Chapter 6, The Art Collective's Secrets. Easter egg 26 is the faction insignia variant, and it exists at the intersection of the game's visual design and its organizational lore in a way that rewards people who pay attention to both. The Ark Raiders faction, the group of surface operatives that players belong to, has a recognizable insignia used on equipment, facility markings, and tactical displays throughout the game. Players see this insignia constantly. But a subset of insignia appearances throughout the game carries a small modification to the standard design, an additional element rendered small enough to look like a printing artifact at casual resolution that the community identified as a deliberate variant. The variant insignia appears exclusively in certain locations, specifically the older sections of the underground complex, the areas that the graffiti timeline from Chapter 2 identified as predating the official establishment of the Ark Raiders organization. The presence of the variant insignia in spaces that predate the organization it belongs to suggests either that the insignia was retroactively applied to older spaces to establish territorial claim, which organizations do, or that a version of the Ark Raiders insignia existed before the organization was officially founded, which would imply the organization itself has older roots than its official founding date acknowledges. The variant design, when compared to the standard design, appears to be a simplified or proto-version of the later design. It contains the core visual elements, but in a less refined arrangement, as if a designer developed the standard insignia from an earlier draft. If the variant is earlier, that draft existed in these underground spaces before the Raiders officially existed. Someone was using a version of this symbol in the underground tunnels before the organization that now uses it was created. Easter egg 27 involves the deleted faction name, which required actual technical archaeology to uncover, not of the game's environment, but of its data structure. Players with modding access to the game's files discovered within the faction data tables that govern how the game assigns organizational affiliation to locations and NPCs, a faction entry that has no corresponding faction in the game's accessible content. It has an internal identifier, a color code, an insignia texture reference, and a name. The name, which appears in the data but nowhere in the game's presented world, is Subsurface Initiative. The faction has no missions, no dialogue, no narrative presence. It simply exists as a data entry, pointing to assets that either were cut or were never fully created. Someone named a faction Subsurface Initiative and then removed them from the game or never finished building them, while leaving the data table entry behind. The color code associated with the Subsurface Initiative in the data is not one that appears on any current faction's insignia or equipment coloring, but it does appear in one place in the game's environment, the trim coloring on the older sections of the underground infrastructure, the same sections where the variant insignia appears, the same sections the graffiti timeline identifies as predating the invasion. The oldest parts of the underground complex use a color scheme that matches the deleted faction's assigned color code. Whether the Subsurface Initiative built the early underground infrastructure, or whether the environmental artists and the faction data architects independently chose the same color for related reasons, is not something the data alone can answer. But the correspondence exists, and in a game this clearly deliberate about its hidden content, that correspondence feels like something. Easter egg 28 is the supply manifest with an impossible material listing, and it is the kind of Easter egg that requires the specific knowledge of knowing what is impossible within the game's established rules. The supply manifest appears in the loading dock area, a physical prop document visible on a clipboard near the dock supervisor's station. Most of the manifest lists materials and equipment that are consistent with the game's world: food supplies, construction materials, fuel, medical supplies, tactical equipment. But one line item on the manifest lists a material designated only by a code, substrate-7. The material's unit of measurement on the manifest is consistent with a bulk solid material. The quantity listed is substantial, enough to fill several shipping containers, but substrate 7 does not appear in any accessible lore document, any terminal entry, any mission briefing, any equipment description. It has no in-game definition. And according to the supply manifest, several shipping container loads of it arrived at the loading dock at some point. The community's research into Substrate 7 has turned up one additional occurrence of the designation in the terminal data fragments from the administrative section. The terminal fragment is corrupted enough that context is lost, but the designation appears alongside text that the community reads as a processing or handling notation, suggesting that Substrate 7 was not simply stored, but was actively worked with. Something was done with it. Several container loads of an unnamed material arrived at the underground facility's loading dock, were processed or handled in some way, documented in terminal systems that are now corrupted and then vanish from the record. The community's best theory, informed by the general direction the other lore Easter eggs point, is that Substrate 7 was a construction material with properties specific to the underground infrastructure project, something that enabled the kind of construction the facility apparently required, and that its anonymization was intentional. You do not give a material a designation instead of a name unless you have reasons for not wanting the name widely known. Easter egg 29 lives in the NPC dialogue system, specifically in the dialogue that certain background characters deliver when the player is in proximity but not directly interacting with them. These ambient dialogue lines are meant to create the impression of a living world, people talking to each other, conducting their business, commenting on events. Most of it is atmospheric flavour. But a community member who had been systematically recording all ambient dialogue for a comprehensive database project flagged one specific exchange between two background characters in the hub facility. The exchange, which plays under specific conditions that the community never fully reverse-engineered, references the original contract and what Subsurface promised. The mention of Subsurface in ambient NPC dialogue, from characters who have no special narrative designation, connecting to the deleted faction discovered in the data files, was the kind of cross-validation the community needed to treat the Subsurface initiative as genuinely significant rather than simply a development artifact. The full ambient dialogue fragment, reconstructed from two recorded instances because the audio quality of a single recording was not sufficient for complete transcription, runs to about 4 sentences. The speakers do not identify themselves or the Subsurface initiative formally. They speak about it the way you speak about something when both people in a conversation already understand the reference. The phrase "what Subsurface promised" appears to be followed by a reference to timeline, specifically a timeline not being met, which suggests that the Subsurface initiative had committed to delivering something by a specific point and had not done so. The conversation is ambient, not triggered by any player action or questline. It is simply happening in the background of a world where two people know something the player does not, and for a fraction of a specific session, you can overhear them. The fact that this dialogue exists connects the deleted faction in the data files to the game's living world in a way that transforms it from a development relic into an actual piece of hidden narrative. Easter egg 30 is the encrypted message in the faction briefing room, and it was the last Easter egg in this chapter to be discovered, which is fitting because it requires knowledge accumulated from several earlier finds to fully interpret. The faction briefing room contains a display board, the kind of physical information board used in pre-digital military contexts, pinned papers, handwritten notes, photographs, maps. Most of the content is legible and thematically consistent with the Raider faction's known activities. But one corner of the board contains a cluster of notes that are written in a character set that is not any natural language the community recognized. It is not a simple cipher substitution of an existing alphabet. It is a distinct character set, potentially invented, with an internal consistency that argues against it being arbitrary decoration. The characters have distinct forms, repeat in patterns consistent with language use, and appear across the board in clusters that suggest sentence or phrase structure. The encrypted character set from the briefing room board has been the subject of the most sustained cryptographic effort in Ark Raiders community history. Progress has been made. The community has established that the character set has approximately 23 distinct base forms, consistent with an alphabet-sized writing system. Statistical analysis of character frequency and distribution patterns is consistent with a natural language in a specific family of phonological structures. But the key, the connection between these characters and any known language that would allow full translation, has not been found. Some community members believe the key exists somewhere in the game and simply has not been located yet. Others believe the developers invented the character set specifically to be indecipherable, to create the appearance of a secret that has no solution. The briefing room's hidden corner holds something written in a language only the developers fully know, and it has been there since release, waiting for someone who speaks it. The Ark Collective's secrets, taken together, suggest an organizational history more complex and less linear than the game's surface narrative presents. A proto-version of the faction insignia appearing before the faction existed. A deleted faction whose color coding matches the oldest infrastructure. Ambient NPC dialogue acknowledging an unmet promise from that faction. A supply manifest listing materials with anonymous designations. An encrypted language on the faction briefing room's private corner. These are the hidden layer of an organization, the things that official history does not record, because organizations, like individuals, have aspects of their past and present that they choose not to document in accessible formats. The Ark Raiders are not simply a faction of surface operatives. They are an organization with roots, debts, secrets, and a history that the game is allowing you to glimpse if you know where to look and are willing to work for the looking. Chapter 7. What the map isn't showing you. Easter egg. 31 brings us to the most spatially disorienting discovery in the game's hidden content, an area that players have navigated through numerous times without any of the game's official map systems acknowledging that the space exists. This is not the blank sector from Chapter 4, which at least has a coordinate label. This area is simply absent from all map representations. Players who use the navigation HUD in this region of the map see a coverage gap. The HUD shows terrain without the usual overlay of map data, as if the cartography ends at the region's boundary and resumes on the other side. The region itself is accessible through normal gameplay movement and contains environmental geometry consistent with the rest of the game's world. But the map does not know it is there. The unmapped area is not large. It is a roughly oval-shaped depression in the surface terrain that sits between two mapped regions, connected to each by gentle slopes that players can traverse naturally. The reason nobody noticed the mapping gap initially is that players passing through this area were looking at the terrain, not at the HUD, and the HUD's absence of overlay information in a passage zone was not something that drew the eye. Once the community started specifically examining the HUD overlay coverage across the entire surface map, the gap became visible. And once people were looking at the unmapped area as a distinct space rather than a passage between two mapped regions, they began noticing details about it that had previously been invisible through context. The depression contains several items of environmental interest that do not appear on the resource map overlay, because the resource map overlay also does not cover this area. There may be more hidden here than anyone has yet catalogued. Easter egg 32 is one that generated heated debate about the reliability of player perception, because what it involves is a building that appears different across separate play sessions. The industrial district on the eastern edge of the surface map contains several structures that serve as landmarks for navigation, and one of these, a former processing facility with a distinctive collapsed roof section is one of the most frequently referenced landmarks in the community. Players identify it by its silhouette on approach. But two community members comparing screenshots from different sessions noticed something. The collapsed roof section was collapsed in different directions. The geometry of the collapse was different, not drastically different, not different enough to make the building unrecognizable, but different enough that someone with a good memory for the shape would notice that the shape had changed. The community initially assumed this was a procedural generation feature, perhaps the game simulating structural settling over time. Testing revealed that the change does not occur within a single session. In any given session, the building is consistent. The change occurs between sessions, suggesting it is session-based rather than time-based. Further observation established that the building appears in one of two states, and that which state it appears in correlates, though the correlation is not perfect, with certain conditions in the player's mission history during their most recent session. The building responds, somehow, to what the player has done. Which specific actions or conditions trigger which state has not been fully mapped, but the community's tentative conclusion is that this is not a bug, but a deliberate design feature, a building that exists in two states and transitions between them based on player behavior, creating a sense of a world that registers what you do without telling you that it has noticed. Easter egg 33 is the underground passage behind the destroyed wall, and I am going to be specific about this because there are several destroyed walls in Ark Raiders underground sections, and the specific one matters. In the maintenance level of the hub facility, there is a section where structural damage from what the environmental storytelling implies was a significant overpressure event has collapsed several walls. The collapse creates blocked corridors and accessible rubble fields, consistent with the game's overall aesthetic of managed decay. Most of the collapsed walls are purely cosmetic. You cannot interact with them, you cannot clear them, they exist to make the space feel damaged. But one specific wall in this section, distinguishable from the others by a hairline crack in the debris pile that is visible at close inspection, can be interacted with. The game provides no prompt. There is no floating indicator suggesting that something is there, but if you push into the crack with the standard player movement, the debris shifts. Not dramatically, not with a physics animation. It just shifts enough to reveal a gap, and through the gap is a passage. The passage behind the destroyed wall is short, narrow, and connects to a small room that does not appear on any facility layout visible in the game. The room contains a single object, a terminal. The terminal is functional, which is remarkable given the state of everything around it. It boots when you interact with it. It runs its startup sequence, and then it presents a login screen with no username field, only a password field. The community has spent considerable time attempting to crack the terminal's password through brute force testing, entering every significant number and phrase that the hidden content throughout the game has surfaced. Nothing has worked. The terminal sits there, powered and waiting, accessible through a passage that the game does not acknowledge, in a room that appears on no map. Whatever it is waiting for, the community has not provided it yet. Easter egg 34 is the skybox anomaly, and it requires specific conditions to observe. A particular time of day within the game cycle, a specific location on the surface map, and a camera angle that is not intuitive during normal gameplay because it requires looking up at approximately 30 degrees while facing a direction that offers no gameplay incentive to face. Players who assemble these conditions see something in the skybox that should not be there. Above the normal atmospheric rendering, in a layer of the sky that typically shows only procedural cloud cover and the ambient light of the sun, there is an object. It is small. It is not moving. It is present for a window of approximately 3 to 4 minutes of in-game time before the lighting conditions shift and it becomes invisible again. The community has described it variously as a structure, a vessel, a platform. At the resolution and distance the skybox renders it, none of these identifications can be confirmed. But it is there, and it is not a cloud, and it is not an arc unit in descent, and it is not any celestial object the game's established world would put there. The skybox anomaly has been the subject of significant visual analysis. Players with high-resolution capture equipment have obtained the clearest possible recordings during the observation window and submitted them to community members with relevant analytical skills. The most consistent observation across multiple analysis attempts is that the object appears to have a regular, geometric silhouette, which argues against it being an environmental or atmospheric artifact, and for it being a rendered object placed intentionally in the skybox. The geometric form suggests manufacture. Something made it. If it is in the skybox above the game world, it is above the surface, which is above where the players are, which is above where the underground complex is. Whatever it is looking down at everything. Easter egg 35 is the flooded basement room, which requires a path through the game's environments that is almost entirely counterintuitive to follow. In the sub-basement level of the eastern industrial section, there is a flooded area that players use as a shortcut when the water level is low enough to wade through. During certain mission states, however, the water level rises and players avoid the flooded area entirely because it offers no benefit and considerable hazard. Community members who chose to enter the flooded area during high water conditions discovered that the flood changes the accessible geometry. Structures that are fully above water during low water conditions become partially submerged and navigable in different ways. And one structure, a concrete foundation element in the eastern corner of the flooded area, reveals a door at its base that is only visible and accessible when the water is high enough. The door is locked from the other side, but it is there. Something is behind it. Something that can only be approached when the water rises. The locked door in the flooded basement is remarkable for what it implies about the design of the space. The space was built with this door in it. The door was placed knowing that players would only encounter it under conditions that most players avoid. Someone designed a locked door that can only be found when the conditions are unfavourable, which is either a puzzle design choice, inviting players to engage with the flooded mechanics in a new way, or a narrative choice, implying that the space behind the door is meant to stay locked. The community has tried every approach to opening it that the game's interaction systems allow. It does not open. It has not opened since the game's release. It is a door in a flooded room behind a secret path, and it is locked, and the game is quiet about why. The geography of hidden content in Ark Raiders, taken as a whole chapter, reveals a world whose actual boundaries do not match its presented boundaries. The unmapped area exists without the map acknowledging it. The building has two states that the game's documentation does not account for. The passage behind the collapsed wall leads to a room that has no floor plan. The skybox contains something the game's lore does not name. The flooded basement has a door that does not open to a space the game allows you to enter. The map is not the territory. The territory is larger, stranger, and more inhabited than the map suggests. Every game has areas players cannot access, geometry that exists for technical rather than narrative reasons. What is distinctive about Ark Raiders' inaccessible spaces is that they appear to have been designed with content in them. The terminal in the hidden room is powered and waiting. The door in the flooded basement was built on both sides. The skybox object has a geometric silhouette. These are not empty spaces accidentally sealed off by development decisions. They are spaces that were built as if someone would eventually access them. Chapter 8, The Final Transmissions, Easter egg 36, requires a specific sequence of actions to trigger, and the sequence is specific enough that its discovery was almost accidental. In the monitoring station where the reset clock terminal lives from Chapter 4, there is a secondary terminal that players occasionally interact with for mission objectives, but otherwise ignore. if you interact with this secondary terminal in a specific session state, specifically after completing a surface run that ends in an extraction failure rather than a successful extraction, and do so within a narrow window of time after loading back into the hub, the terminal presents a screen state it does not normally show. Instead of its standard monitoring display, it shows a text message, and only this text message, filling the screen in plain block characters. The message reads, "Your frequency has been noted." And then, if you wait without interacting, the terminal returns to its standard display as if nothing happened. The phrase, "Your frequency has been noted," has been analysed from every angle the community could apply to it. Taken at face value within the game's fiction, it implies that something, some monitoring system or entity, has registered the player's presence, or more specifically, the player's operational frequency, which could be read as their pattern of activity, their timing, their method. The trigger condition is significant. The message only appears after an extraction failure. If your frequency refers to how you're operating on the surface, then a failed extraction is, in frequency terms, a different signal than a successful one. Something noticed the failure. Something noted that the player had been on the surface, failed to extract, and returned. Whether that something is benevolent, neutral, or threatening is not communicated by the message. It has noted the frequency. It does not say what it will do with that information. Easter egg 37 is the distress beacon, and it is the Easter egg in this video that I find most personally affecting as a piece of environmental storytelling. In the outer reaches of the surface playable area, past the primary resource zones where most players spend their time, there is a beacon marker visible on the terrain if you know roughly where to look. Not a mission marker, not a resource indicator, not an enemy spawn point. A physical object sitting on the surface, a small electronic device of the kind the game depicts as emergency signalling equipment. The beacon is active. It is transmitting. Its internal light is blinking in a pattern consistent with a distress signal, and it has been there, blinking, since the game launched. Nobody put it there as a mission objective. Nobody sent you to find it. It is simply broadcasting from a spot most players never visit, in a part of the map most players cross only incidentally. The beacon carries an inscription, visible only at very close range, that functions as its point of origin data. The inscription contains partial coordinates, formatted in the same system as the workbench scratches from Chapter 2. The partial coordinates place the beacon's intended destination, not its current location, in the vicinity of the blank map sector from Chapter 4. Someone launched a distress beacon toward a location that does not officially exist on the game's maps. They aimed a cry for help at a sealed, unmapped destination. The community's reading is that whoever sent this beacon knew about the blank sector, expected someone at or associated with that location to receive the signal, and apparently received no response. The beacon is still broadcasting because no one came. It has been broadcasting since the game launched in a part of the map few players visit, aimed at a place that does not appear on any map, and the game just lets it blink. Easter egg 38 is the video file, and this one required technical access rather than in-game exploration to locate. In the same hidden folder that contained the 43-second audio file from Chapter 1, players with file system access found a video file labelled with a similar naming convention: a date, an underscore, a 3-letter suffix. The file is not a cinematic. It is not part of any mission sequence. It is a short video, approximately 90 seconds long, rendered in a deliberately degraded visual style that mimics the look of low-quality digital recording equipment. The content of the video is a recording of a terminal display, showing a scrolling readout of system data. At the very beginning of the video, before the terminal display fills the frame, there is approximately 3 seconds of a different view. What appears to be a room, out of focus, with a person partially visible at the edge of the frame. In those 3 seconds, the person moves, and then the view shifts to the terminal display, and the person is gone. The 3 seconds of partial human visibility at the start of the video file generated enormous community discussion about what can be inferred from such brief, out-of-focus footage. The figure is too indistinct to identify in any conventional sense, but observers noted that the room visible in those 3 seconds, specifically the portion of it in focus behind the figure, contains architectural details consistent with the administrative section of the underground complex. Someone was recording a terminal display in the administrative section and briefly captured themselves or someone else in frame before correcting the camera angle. The terminal display itself, the 90 seconds of data scrolling that follows the accidental human appearance, contains legible text in fragments, mission designations, resource tallies, and near the end of the scroll, a status notation that the community read as extraction protocol, suspended pending second surface confirmation. Second surface, the same phrase from the 43-second audio file. 2 separate hidden files, one audio, one video, both referencing the confirmation of a second surface. Easter egg 39 is the last mission log, and it is the most explicitly narrative piece of hidden content in the game, buried in the accessible terminal data of the hub facility, in a folder path that requires navigating through several levels of subdirectories within a terminal that most players use only for its surface-level functions. There is a log file marked with an asterisk in its file name, which is a character that is not used in any other game file's naming convention. The log is a text document, formatted as a personal mission record rather than an official briefing. It reads like someone writing for themselves rather than for a report. The voice is informal, the observations are personal, the tone suggests someone who is processing an experience rather than documenting it for institutional purposes. The date on the log predates the game's acknowledged invasion timeline. The author of the log is not identified by name, only by a call sign, Compass. The content of Compass's log describes a surface mission, unlike any in the game's acknowledged mission types. The mission, as described, involved descending to a sub-level below the underground complex, rather than ascending to the surface. The log's author went down. They were looking for something. The description is vague on specifics, but consistently uses the phrase, the second access point. They found something, though the description of what they found is the most corrupted section of the log and requires interpretation. What can be read with confidence is the log's final entry, which is a single line that the author appears to have added separately from the main body, as if returning to the log after an interval. They're aware of us, both directions. The arc units on the surface and something beneath the underground complex are both aware of human presence. The log of Compass describes a moment of terrible symmetry, something above and something below, both awake, both watching. Easter egg 40 is the second wave warning, and it exists in a location that most players interact with at the end of sessions without reading carefully. The endgame data displays, the screens that show mission results and resource tallies at the conclusion of a surface run, contain more information than players typically absorb in the transition moment between active play and the hub return sequence. But buried in the statistical readout of a specific session end display type, specifically the display that appears after a session in which the player has observed more than a threshold number of arc units during a surface run. There is an additional line of text at the bottom of the readout that appears below the standard formatting boundary. It is cut off by the display's edge, but enough is visible to read. Warning, wave pattern inconsistent with known protocols. The text is formatted identically to the official system warnings that appear elsewhere in the UI. It looks official, but it references wave patterns that are inconsistent with known protocols, which implies that someone within the game's fiction is monitoring the Ark invasion's patterns and has noticed something unexpected. The second wave warning is significant because it uses the word known, which implies that there are Ark invasion protocols that were known before the observation of inconsistency. If there are known protocols for Ark invasion behavior, that knowledge had to come from somewhere. Protocols are either established by the entity exhibiting the behavior, which would mean the Ark units have observable behavioral patterns that humanity has documented, or they are established through prior contact or intelligence gathering that allowed the invasion's patterns to be predicted. Either way, someone knew enough about the Ark to establish what normal Ark invasion behavior looks like, and now that baseline is being violated. The violation is being noted in an automated system, warning that most players never see. The second wave is coming, and it is not following the playbook that human analysts apparently had. Easter egg 40 through 43 form a final sequence that this chapter will carry you through, and that sequence builds on everything you have heard in this video. Each of the 4 final Easter eggs pushes in the same direction, toward the same conclusion, suggesting that the hidden content of Ark Raiders is not a collection of isolated secrets, but a single, layered argument about what this world really is and how it really works. The argument has been building since the first radio signal in the relay station, and it reaches its fullest expression in the final 3 Easter eggs of the next chapter, which close this video. Before we get there, this chapter's 5 secrets collectively demonstrate that the game's narrative layer, the one you reach by reading mission logs and decoding terminal data and watching endgame readouts, is as deliberate and as constructed as the audio and visual hidden content. The game is telling a story in every medium available to it, in sound, in image, in text, in space, in objects. The question has always been which parts of that story the player was supposed to hear, and which parts were meant only for those who would listen carefully enough. Chapter 9, The 3 That Break Everything. Easter egg 41 requires a form of knowledge that most players do not carry into their gaming sessions: awareness of the naming conventions used by real space programs for missions and spacecraft. The Ark units in Ark Raiders are designated by an alphanumeric system that the game presents as internally consistent but arbitrary in origin. Most unit designations follow patterns that feel generated for aesthetic purposes, functional sounds that convey machine identity without specific real-world reference. But one unit designation, visible on a specific Ark unit encountered in a specific area of the map under specific mission conditions, deviates from this pattern. The designation on this unit matches with one character transposed, the designation of a real space mission from the late 20th century. A space mission that was notable specifically for being the first of its type to return physical samples from outside Earth's immediate gravitational environment. The community's debate about whether the matching designation is intentional has largely concluded in favor of intentionality, based on the logic that a random alphanumeric generator producing a match with a specific historically significant mission name, even with one character transposed, is a lower probability event than a developer choosing the reference deliberately. The transposition itself has been read as a deliberate distancing move, close enough to be recognizable to someone who knows the reference, different enough to maintain plausible deniability as coincidence. The significance of the specific mission referenced is the part that lands hardest in the context of Ark Raiders lore. The real mission brought back material from space. The Ark unit, whose designation echoes that mission's name, also came from space. The implied connection, one possible reading of what this Easter egg suggests, is that the Ark units and the sample return mission are related in some way, that the first thing humanity brought back from outside its gravitational neighborhood may have been the first contact, or that the Ark units themselves were in some sense a response to humanity's reaching beyond its environment. The 40-second Easter egg is the one that the community has been building toward in all its prior research, and it is the most unsettling piece of evidence that Ark Raider's hidden layer contains. Because if the reading holds up, it changes the fundamental nature of what the game is about. Distributed across the environmental storytelling of the game, in locations that are spread enough that no single player could assemble the complete picture from memory, there is a set of details that individually read as consistent with the game's general aesthetic of post-invasion infrastructure maintenance, structural reinforcements, drainage systems, ventilation modifications, power rerouting. These are the mundane details of keeping underground facilities operational under difficult conditions. But when the community catalogued every such detail, they could document and mapped the modifications chronologically using the same methodology as the graffiti timeline. They found that the modifications do not correspond to maintenance. The structural modifications visible in the environmental storytelling, when mapped and dated, describe the progressive optimization of the underground complex for a specific function. Not survival, not defense, not resource management. The optimization trajectory, following the community's analysis, is consistent with the progressive preparation of the underground space to sustain life for a much larger population than currently inhabits it, at a much greater depth than the current lowest accessible level, for a much longer period than the game's current timeline suggests would be necessary. Someone has been preparing the underground complex not for the current crisis, but for a future that is significantly longer, deeper, and more populous than what the present situation requires. The preparation suggests foreknowledge not just of the invasion, but of everything that follows it. A future in which humanity goes much deeper underground and stays there for a very long time. Easter egg 43 is the last one, and it is the simplest, and it is the one that has stayed with me longest after compiling this video. During the loading screen transitions between the hub and the surface, there is a sequence of visual frames that functions as the game's visual equivalent of a loading screen. Most players do not look closely at loading screens. They are visually consistent from session to session, showing the game's established aesthetic, and they are by definition transitional moments that players are waiting to pass through rather than examining. But community members who recorded loading screen footage and went through it frame by frame found a single, anomalous frame. Not a consistent feature, not something that appears every session. A single frame appearing in a specific loading transition under conditions that the community has attempted to pin down but cannot fully reproduce. That is different from every other loading screen frame. It is dark, almost entirely, except for a central element. In the center of this single anomalous frame, for the duration of one frame, at the game's render rate, there is an image of a compass pointing down, the compass pointing down, the same symbol from the graffiti in Chapter 2, the same symbol found beside the unknown initials in Chapter 3. Compass, the call sign of the mission log, author in Chapter 8. The compass in the loading screen points down for exactly one frame, in a transition that most players experience as a blank moment between locations, and then it is gone. It appears for the minimum visible duration. It is maximally easy to miss, and it is the clearest possible summary of everything the hidden content of Ark Raiders has been pointing toward. Down, something down. The underground that the game acknowledges as sanctuary, the deeper underground that the structural modifications suggest is being prepared. The coordinates that point below the lowest accessible level, the second access point that Compass was looking for. The route marked by Remember Oslo, depth 7. The second surface that requires confirmation before protocols can proceed. Everything in the hidden layer of this game eventually resolves in the same direction. Down. The compass shows you down for one frame, and then the surface loads, and the game begins, and you go up to fight the thing that is falling from above. But the hidden layer of Ark Raiders, every secret sound and image and text fragment assembled across months of community effort is telling you that the real story is not above, it is below, and someone has been getting ready for it for a very long time. The compass frame is not the only single frame anomaly the community has documented in the loading transitions, but it is the most consistently reproducible of the lot, and it is the one with the clearest contextual connection to the rest of the hidden content. Players who began systematically recording and analysing loading transitions after the compass frame discovery found 2 additional single-frame events in different transitions. One is an image of text too small and brief to transcribe with confidence from standard recordings. The other is what appears to be a schematic, a technical drawing of some kind, visible for 1 frame before the destination loads. Both of these additional single-frame events remain largely undeciphered. The text frame has been enlarged and enhanced by multiple community members and continues to produce inconsistent results. The schematic frame is clearer in outline but ambiguous in content, showing a structure of some kind with what appears to be multiple levels indicated by horizontal lines. Whether those levels indicate the known underground complex, the deeper levels the structural modifications are preparing, or something else entirely, is a question the image cannot answer at its available resolution. The 43rd Easter egg, the compass pointing down, was found last, which is either fitting or coincidental, depending on how you read the relationship between discovery sequence and significance. The community's final Easter egg happened to be the one that functioned as the clearest summary of everything else. Whether that is because the developers intended it to be found last, seeding it in the most obscure possible location, in full knowledge that the community would save the most difficult discovery for late in the investigation, or whether it is simply the order in which the puzzle resolved, is something that only the people who built it know. The compass points down. 43 secrets point towards something that has not yet been revealed. And the game keeps running, and the surface keeps being invaded, and somewhere below the lowest accessible level of the underground complex, in a space that nobody has reached, and that the map does not show, something is either waiting to be found, or is watching the players above it with the same patient attention that the hidden layer of Ark Raiders has demanded of the community from the beginning. Oslo. Chapter 10. What was left behind? There are objects in Ark Raiders that exist in states of incompletion, and the incompletion is itself communicative. Easter egg 43 may close the numbered sequence, but the hidden layer of this game does not stop at a count. It continues in the texture of every space the game has built, in every detail that rewards the player who decides to stop extracting resources for a moment and simply look around. This chapter is about what the hidden content leaves behind once you've found it, what it teaches about the game's philosophy of world building, and what it suggests about the spaces that exist between the numbered Easter eggs. It is about the residue of deliberate construction. The first thing the hidden content leaves behind is a revised understanding of time in Ark Raiders. The game presents its world as a snapshot of a specific crisis moment. The invasion is ongoing, humanity is underground, the surface is dangerous, but the Easter eggs collectively reveal a world with a long past and an implied long future. The graffiti timeline extends before the invasion. The production date stamps document a project that completed before the invasion began. The structural modifications suggest preparation for conditions that extend far beyond the current crisis. The hidden audio files briefing references operations in locations that do not appear on the current map. Time in Ark Raiders, as revealed by its hidden layer, is not a snapshot. It is a long exposure. The second residue is a sense of inhabited depth. The game's playable world is generous in size but fundamentally horizontal. Surface, subsurface, underground, a few levels of depth. The hidden content keeps gesturing downward. Depth 7. Coordinates that point below the lowest accessible level. a compass that points down in a single loading frame, the locked door in the flooded basement behind which the game places something it will not let you reach, the blank map sector that the navigation system knows about, but that the playable terrain ends before. The game's presented world has a floor, and the hidden content suggests the floor is a ceiling for something below it. Whatever is beneath the floor of Ark Raider's playable world, the game has spent considerable effort making sure that careful players know to wonder about it. The third residue is the question of agency. Many of the Easter eggs in this video are passive. They are information given to the player about the world, fragments of a larger story that the player receives but cannot act on. The hidden terminal in the passage behind the collapsed wall is active, but it requires a password. The locked door in the flooded basement is accessible, but it does not open. The blank map sector is marked in the navigation system, but the terrain ends before you reach it. The compass points down, but there is nothing below to go to. The game's hidden layer is remarkably good at creating the sensation of standing at the threshold of something without ever allowing the threshold to be crossed. The Easter eggs show you doors. The doors are closed. This pattern of closed doors running through Ark Raider's hidden content is either a development choice to leave story threads unresolved pending future content, or a deliberate narrative construction in which the closing of the doors is itself the message. Not every story requires resolution in the conventional sense. Some stories are about the limits of what can be known, about what it feels like to see a door and have no key, about how people and organizations and worlds persist through crisis by preserving secrets rather than revealing them. The hidden content of Ark Raiders could be read as a meditation on necessary mystery. Certain things remain locked, not because the game failed to complete them, but because the world it depicts is one in which certain knowledge is protected at great cost. The sound design choices across all the audio Easter eggs maintain a consistent philosophy. Information is buried at the threshold of perceptibility, not beyond perception, but at its edge. The radio signal at 7.3 MHz is real to human ears, with the right equipment and the right listening. The Morse code in the tunnel drips is there, but it requires effort to hear it as code rather than ambience. The voice in the static says it is still here in a frequency range that most playback systems handle imperfectly. The hidden audio file requires knowing where to look before you can find it, and what it contains requires slowing the playback and adjusting the pitch before you can understand it. The game's audio hidden layer was built with a theory of listening in mind, that genuine attention, properly applied, can find things that casual experience cannot. That is both a design principle and an argument about the value of careful engagement with the world. The visual Easter eggs maintain a parallel philosophy. Information is positioned where your eye will not naturally go. The photograph is behind a vent panel. The portrait detail is at the bottom of the frame. The reflection anomaly requires approaching the cooling tank from a specific, counterintuitive angle. The compass frame is one frame in a loading transition. The graffiti timeline requires organizing screenshots after the fact rather than reading it in sequence during play. None of the visual hidden content demands your eye. All of it rewards your eye if you choose to give it. The game is patient about this. It has been patient since launch. The textual Easter eggs, the graffiti, the terminal fragments, the mission logs, the supply manifests, the ambient dialogue are perhaps the most demanding of all the hidden content categories because they require the player to read carefully in a medium that tends toward action. Games train players to scan text quickly and move on, read the objective, skip the flavor. Ark Raider's hidden textual content was built for the player who reads the flavor, who notices that the manifest has an item that should not be there, who reads the ambient dialogue carefully enough to catch a phrase that connects to data file archaeology, who looks at the bottom of a portrait frame to see if anything is written there. The textual hidden layer is for the reader. The game hid its deepest story in words, in a medium where words are frequently ignored. The Subsurface Initiative thread, spanning the deleted faction entry, the color coding in the oldest infrastructure, the ambient dialogue, and the encrypted character set in the briefing room, is the piece of hidden content I keep returning to when I try to understand what the developers were doing when they built Arc Raider's hidden layer. It is the most connected thread, multiple discovery types, multiple locations, multiple timeframes, all pointing at the same invisible organization. The Subsurface Initiative existed. It made a promise that it did not keep. Its color coding is on the oldest walls. Its name appears in private conversation. Its written records are in a language that has not been cracked. Whatever it was significant enough to earn architectural presence, institutional memory, and encrypted documentation. And the developers chose not to explain it. They left it as a form the player must fill in from insufficient evidence. That is a specific choice about what kind of story a game can tell and how. The chessboard in the commander's quarters has stayed in my mind longer than any other single object in this video, and it is worth returning to it once more at this late point in the script. Someone, somewhere in the Arc Raiders development process, decided to put a chessboard in the commander's quarters and to set it in a specific position from a specific historical match. That is a decision that required knowledge. Knowledge of chess history, knowledge of which match would carry the right resonance, knowledge of how to render a specific position accurately enough to be recognized. It is a decision that required confidence, confidence that the right players would notice the board, identify the position, recognize the match, and understand what the choice of that specific match communicates about the commander and the world they inhabit. The chessboard requires the player to know something about the world outside the game in order to unlock its meaning. It is hidden not behind a false wall or a frequency filter, but behind literacy, behind culture, behind the willingness to bring your knowledge of the real world into a fictional space and let the two illuminate each other. This is, I think, what the best Easter eggs do. They do not just hide information inside the game. They create a connection between the game's interior world and the exterior world of the player. The shortwave frequency connects to real radio history. The chess match connects to real AI history. The mission designation, echoing a real space mission, connects to real space history. The Remember Oslo thread connects to a real city whose name carries weight in a particular reading of European geography and history. These are not references for reference's sake. They are invitations for the player's knowledge of the real world to enter the game's fiction and make contact, producing a resonance that neither the game nor the player's knowledge could produce alone. The Easter eggs are interfaces between worlds. The 43 secrets in this video were found over the course of months by a community of players who collectively represent an enormous investment of time and attention. Individual community members like Raelthus, Dawnrise Actual, Vex Meridian, the unnamed chess expert, the audio engineers, the data archaeologists with their modding tools, and file explorers contributed specialized knowledge in service of a collective project of understanding. The Easter eggs in Arc Raiders are not the kind of content that one player can find alone. The breadth of knowledge required, spanning audio engineering, cryptography, chess history, space program history, radio history, data analysis, architectural reading, horticultural identification, and more, exceeds any single person's expertise. The hidden layer of Arc Raiders was built for communities, not individuals. It requires collective intelligence to penetrate, which means it was, in a sense, a gift to the community of people who would care enough to work together on it. That quality of collective address is visible in how the Easter eggs fit together. If the audio discoveries were the only ones, they would be a complete but isolated set of secrets. If the graffiti timeline were the only hidden content, it would be a complete but isolated piece of environmental storytelling. But the connection between the audio content and the graffiti, between the subsurface initiative data and the architectural color coding, between the production date timeline and the structural modifications, between the coordinates scratched on the workbench and the blank sector on the navigation map, between the compass in the graffiti and the compass in the briefing room and the compass in the loading frame. These connections were not meant to be found by any one player running down a single thread. They were meant to be assembled from multiple threads by multiple people comparing notes. The whole is larger than any of its parts, and the whole only becomes visible when the community does what communities do: share, compare, synthesize. The researchers who spent months in this world, who revisited familiar spaces with new eyes after each new discovery, who sat in a tunnel listening to water drip until they heard the code in the rhythm, who organized hundreds of screenshots into a chronological sequence to find the story in the graffiti, who spent weeks decoding serial numbers on machines nobody else had thought to examine. They were doing something that the game was built to make possible. Arc Raiders created a hidden world that rewards exactly this kind of sustained, attentive, collaborative engagement. Whatever the developers intended by building this hidden layer, they clearly expected that if they built something worth finding, someone would find it. The question of what comes next is the one the hidden content of Arc Raiders most insistently raises without answering. The terminal in the secret room is powered and waiting. The door in the flooded basement has not opened. The blank map sector exists without content. The encrypted character set has not been cracked. The identity of the portrait subject named Lindqvist has not been confirmed. The full content of the Remember Oslo thread has not been resolved. Compass's second access point has not been found. The skybox object has not been identified. The second surface has not been confirmed. These are not resolved mysteries, these are open files. The community's investigation is ongoing, and the game's hidden layer has not been fully mapped. There are 43 Easter eggs in this video, but the investigation that produced them has not closed with the count. The compass points down, and no one has yet found a way to go. Arc Raiders is still receiving updates. The community pays attention to every patch, every change to the game's file structure, every addition to the audio or the environment or the map. New content could open the locked door. A future update could introduce the text that unlocks the terminal. The blank map sector could become playable. The encrypted character set could find its key somewhere in content yet to be released. Or none of this will happen, and the hidden layer will persist as a sealed document, complete in itself, pointing toward a story that the developers have chosen to leave in the form of pointing rather than arrival. Either outcome is consistent with the philosophy visible in the Easter eggs themselves. Information at the threshold of perceptibility, doors that exist but do not open, compasses pointing toward destinations you cannot yet reach. The game's hidden layer has the same structure as the game's emotional register. It shows you something just beyond your grasp and asks what you do with the reaching. The 43 secrets in this video are the community's answer to that question. The reaching produced this: months of listening, reading, looking, recording, analyzing, comparing, and synthesizing produced a map of the hidden world that sits inside Arc Raiders. A map that does not cover everything and cannot cover everything, but that is more complete than anything any single player could have made alone. The map points down. The game keeps running. The signal at 7.3 MHz keeps cycling its 4-minute, 17-second loop. The beacon at the edge of the playable surface keeps blinking toward a sector that does not appear on any official chart. The reset clock counts down its 43 seconds and begins again. The compass in the loading frame appears for one frame and disappears. And somewhere in the underground complex, in a room behind a collapsed wall that the game does not tell you to push against, a terminal that nobody built a path to sits powered and patient, waiting for the right password, cycling its prompt on whatever clock governs things that were built to outlast the crisis they were built inside of. The hidden layer of Ark Raiders does not end, it waits. Chapter 11. Echoes in the Architecture. The architecture of Ark Raiders is not neutral. Every game builds spaces with a logic behind them, a set of decisions made by level designers and environmental artists about what a space should feel like, how it should be navigated, what it should communicate to the player moving through it. Most games build spaces primarily for gameplay, sightlines, cover opportunities, flow between objectives. Ark Raiders does this, but it does something else as well. Its spaces carry a second logic, a narrative logic that operates beneath the gameplay logic. And the Easter eggs we have covered in this video are in many ways simply the most concentrated expressions of that second logic. This chapter is about reading the architecture itself as a form of hidden content about what the spaces of Ark Raiders communicate when you stop moving through them and start looking at them. The hub facility, the base of operations that players return to between surface runs, is the most frequently visited space in the game, and because it's so familiar, it is one of the least examined. Familiarity breeds a form of blindness. When you know a space well enough to move through it without thinking, you stop seeing it as a space and start experiencing it as a collection of navigation habits. The Easter eggs hiding in the hub facility, several of which we have already covered, were hidden there precisely because the developers understood this dynamic. The most visited space is also the least looked at space once a player has internalized its layout. The portrait in the commander's quarters survived months without detection, not because it was deeply hidden, but because the commander's quarters is a space players pass through with established destination awareness. The portrait hangs in a room you already know. It waits for the first time you look at the room instead of through it. The processing facility on the surface, the one players use as a landmark and navigational reference, is architecturally interesting in a way that the gameplay use of it obscures. Players navigate around it, use its walls as cover, extract resources from its surrounding terrain. Almost nobody examines its foundation. The foundation of the processing facility, specifically the section visible when you navigate into the depression at its northeastern corner, shows construction techniques that differ from the rest of the building's visible construction. The main structure uses materials and methods consistent with the game's established aesthetic of pre-invasion industrial construction. The foundation at the northeastern corner uses materials and methods that the community's architectural readers recognized as consistent with the underground complex, not with surface construction. The northeastern corner of this surface processing facility was built using underground construction techniques. Either someone who knew how to build underground built part of this surface structure, or this surface structure is connected to something below it. The spatial relationship between the surface processing facility and the underground complex has been a subject of community mapping work that predates the discovery of the Northeastern Foundation anomaly. Players who paid close attention to the navigation HUD's depth indicators while moving between the facility and the underground complex noted that the processing facility sits almost directly above a section of the underground's restricted access area, specifically the section where several of the most significant lore Easter eggs are concentrated. The administrative section with the workbench coordinates, the memorial graffiti, the "They came from below" inscription. These underground spaces sit in a vertical relationship to the surface processing facility. The facility is above the secrets. Whether that vertical relationship is architecturally meaningful, whether there is a physical connection between the surface structure and the underground space directly below it, is a question the game has not yet allowed the community to answer. The foundation anomaly suggests the connection exists. The playable map does not allow you to trace it. The residential quarters of the underground complex rewards the kind of room-by-room patient examination that gameplay pressures make difficult. Each residential unit is a small space with modest differentiation from its neighbours. The game does not give every unit a completely distinct visual identity, because that would be prohibitively expensive to produce and not meaningful to most gameplay uses of the space. But the differentiation that does exist is not random. The units that carry the most distinctive environmental details, the ones where objects of particular interest appear, the ones where the graffiti record is richest, are not distributed randomly through the residential block. They cluster. The most information-dense residential units share a section of the complex that the architectural analysis identifies as the oldest subsection of the residential block, consistent with the pre-invasion construction timeline that the graffiti suggests. The people who lived in the oldest part of the complex left the most traces, whether because they were there longest or because they had the most to record, or because something about who they were made documentation a priority. The oldest rooms hold the most. One specific residential unit in that oldest cluster contains an object arrangement that the community flagged as significant, but that does not rise to the level of a standalone Easter egg on its own. The arrangement is a desk with several items placed on it in a configuration that is too deliberate to be randomly generated set dressing. There is a notebook whose pages are rendered as blank. Not blurred text, not abstracted writing, but genuinely blank pages visible when you look at the open notebook at close range. There is a cup of writing instruments. There is a small framed image rendered at low enough resolution to be unidentifiable. And there is a handwritten note placed beside the blank notebook, partially under the cup of writing instruments, whose visible portion reads, "Start here." The blank notebook, the writing instruments, and the instruction to start here sit together on a desk in an old residential unit and form a prompt that the game does not complete. Someone left a workspace ready for someone else to use. The someone else never came or came and left without writing, and the blank notebook waits. The medical wing of the underground complex is one of the areas the community initially paid less attention to because its function seems self-explanatory. An underground society would need medical facilities, and the visual language of those facilities would be consistent with the game's general aesthetic of functional spaces managing scarcity. But the medical wing contains an organizational anomaly that becomes visible once you have absorbed the production date timeline and structural modification analysis from earlier chapters. The medical equipment in the wing is not uniformly from the same era. Most of it is consistent with the period immediately surrounding the invasion, the kind of emergency procurement and improvisation you would expect from a population transitioning underground under crisis conditions. But a subset of the equipment is older, significantly older, rendered with materials and construction aesthetics consistent with a period of at least 20 years before the invasion. Equipment of that age in the medical wing of a facility suggests two things. Either the equipment was brought from somewhere that had been operational for a long time, or the medical wing itself has been operational for a long time. The second reading implies that the underground medical facility was seeing patients well before the invasion made underground living a general reality. The weapons storage section of the hub facility is primarily a gameplay space. Players interact with it for loadout purposes, for resource management, for mission preparation. The room is designed to facilitate these interactions efficiently, but the room also contains, if you look at the wall behind the primary storage racks rather than at the racks themselves, a series of markings that read as inventory notations from different periods. The style and apparent age of these notations varies, consistent with the multi-period record that appears throughout the underground complex's written surfaces. What is notable about the weapons storage notation specifically is a designation that appears several times in the oldest notation layer, repeated with the consistency that suggest it was a frequently handled category of material. The designation is SFC. The community has proposed multiple expansions of this acronym. The most widely circulated is Surface Forward Cache, which would imply that the weapon storage was at some point maintaining caches of materials that were being pushed toward the surface rather than held in reserve below. Someone was stocking up for operations above, in a facility that was supposedly built to shelter people below. The transit corridors connecting the different functional sections of the underground complex have been the subject of an analysis methodology that borrowed from the production date timeline work, systematic cataloguing of every visible detail across the full length of each corridor. This is not glamorous work, and it took a team of community members several weeks to complete the primary corridors. What the analysis produced was a density map of information. Some corridors are almost empty of detail, consistent with purely functional transit spaces. Others are rich with layered information, multiple generations of marking, varied material evidence, the accumulated record of a space that has been used continuously for a long time. The density of information in specific corridors does not correlate with their gameplay importance. Some of the most information-rich corridors are ones that players avoid because they offer no strategic advantage. The game has hidden its richest environmental storytelling in the spaces that competitive or objective-focused players have no incentive to visit. The water management section of the underground complex, accessible through a maintenance hatch that most players pass without attempting to open, is one of those high-density spaces. The water management infrastructure is visually unremarkable. Pipes, valves, gauges, the unglamorous machinery that keeps a large underground population supplied with processed water. But the community members who entered the section and documented it systematically found something embedded in the infrastructure that required significant contextual knowledge to interpret. The pipe routing in the water management section does not match the facility layout as it currently exists. The pipes route water to sections of the complex that do not appear on any accessible floor plan, sections that are either structurally inaccessible or that exist beyond the playable boundaries of the underground space. The water is being routed to places that the player cannot go. Wherever those places are, they require water. Wherever they are, the infrastructure was built to serve them. Whatever is down there, it is alive in the sense that matters most. It needs water. The idea that the underground complex extends significantly beyond its playable boundaries, that the accessible portion of the facility represents only a fraction of its total architecture, is one that the hidden content of Ark Raiders points toward repeatedly from different angles. The structural modifications preparing for a larger and deeper population, the pipe routing toward inaccessible sections, the coordinates pointing below the lowest accessible level, the blank map sector, the locked door in the flooded basement. Taken together, these details construct a picture of an iceberg. The playable game is what shows above the water, and the hidden content is the tip of the portion below, giving you just enough of the submerged shape to understand that there is much more below the surface than the surface reveals. The lighting design of Ark Raiders' underground spaces does something that most players will never consciously register, but that contributes significantly to the emotional texture of the hidden content. The game uses two distinct lighting philosophies in the underground complex. The official, gameplay-relevant spaces are lit to facilitate player navigation and combat. The lighting is functional, consistent with the game's general aesthetic, and designed to be read quickly. The unofficial, hidden, or architecturally anomalous spaces are lit differently. They tend toward warmer or cooler color temperatures, depending on their apparent age, and they use practical light sources, light that appears to come from within the space itself rather than from the neutral, overhead sources of the functional areas. The warm, practical lighting in old spaces creates an intimacy that the game's functional lighting does not. It makes the space feel inhabited by memory rather than by action. The light in the old residential quarters falls like the light in a room where someone once lived and left the lamp burning. The sound design of the underground spaces, beyond the hidden audio Easter eggs we covered in Chapter 1, carries its own hidden layer of environmental information. The acoustic signature of each space in Ark Raiders has been tuned to reflect its architectural characteristics. The reverb time, the frequency response, the directional behavior of sound within the space all correspond to the physical properties of the environment as rendered. This is standard practice in high-quality game audio, but Ark Raiders takes it a step further in the architecturally anomalous spaces. The water management section sounds different from the spaces near it in ways that exceed what the visible geometry would predict. It sounds larger. The reverb suggests a space with significantly greater volume than the visible room. Players with audio experience who documented the section's acoustic signature estimated that the reverberation characteristics were consistent with a space approximately 4 to 5 times the visible room's volume. Something behind the walls of the water management section is resonating with the sound produced inside it. Something large. The ceiling of the water management section has been examined closely by the community following the acoustic anomaly documentation. The ceiling is covered by infrastructure in most of the section, pipes and conduits that prevent clear inspection of the material behind them. But in one corner where the infrastructure is slightly less dense, the ceiling material is visible, and it is not the same material as the surrounding walls. The walls use standard underground construction materials, consistent with the rest of the facility. The ceiling in that corner uses something different, a material with a texture and colour that the community's environmental arts readers identified as more consistent with natural stone than constructed material. Not carved stone, prepared and finished for construction. Natural stone with the irregular surface texture of undressed rock. The corner of the water management section has a natural stone ceiling. The facility, in that corner, was built up against or into existing geological material. Someone found a natural space and built around it. And what you hear in that section when you make a sound is the cave. The relationship between constructed and natural space in Ark Raiders' underground complex is taken as an architectural observation deeply significant for the game's lore. The presence of natural stone in the water management section ceiling suggests that the underground facility was not purely excavated but was in part built into existing geological features. Natural caves, cavern systems, underground rivers. These would be significant resources for anyone building a long-term underground habitation facility. The fact that the facility, built around natural geology, implies that the builders had access to geological survey data that identified suitable natural spaces before construction began. Serious geological surveying of a specific site, detailed enough to identify cave systems at depth, is not emergency work. It is the work of years of planning. The cave ceiling in the water management section is evidence added to everything else that the underground complex was planned over a very long time by people who knew exactly what they were building toward. The structural columns that run through the facility's main thoroughfares have been examined by the community in the same systematic way as the walls, and what they found in the oldest columns is consistent with the two-phase construction thesis that earlier architectural analysis established. The oldest columns bear tool marks on their surfaces that are different from the marks left by the equipment used to construct the newer sections of the facility.